This is part 4 of my lecture, The Hellenization of Christianity by the Scholastics. And it's titled, The Ways in Which Philosophy or Mythology are Glorified. Now we're going to first give you the general categories, and then we're going to go over them one at a time. The 3 ways that philosophy or mythology are glorified are: 1, by using philosophy or mythology to edify or enlighten oneself or others on faith or morals. 2, by using methods unique to philosophy. 3, by using terminologies unique to philosophy, which I call scholastic babble. Now, in each one of these 3 sections, there's subdivisions. The first one, which was by using philosophy or mythology to edify or enlighten oneself or others on faith or morals. A, they do this by presenting philosophy or mythology as a true religion, or a religion in which one can be saved. B, by presenting philosophy or mythology as necessary or useful to better understand Christianity. C, by presenting philosophy or mythology as necessary or useful to live a moral and virtuous life. D, by using philosophy as a source of revelation on faith or morals. And E, by loving or at least liking philosophy or mythology. The second way of by using methods unique to philosophy, these are the subcategories. A, by emphasizing questions and not answers. B, by presenting dogmas and heresies as allowable opinions. C, by defending heresies and dogmas equally before saying which is heresy or dogma. D, by willful ambiguity or willful contradictions. E, by complicating answers. And F, by not denouncing heretics as heretics. And the third technique, by using terminologies unique to philosophy, there's just one subsection in that which we'll go over when we get to it. Now we're going to go over these one at a time. We're going to start with by using philosophy or mythology to edify or enlighten oneself on faith or morals. A, by presenting philosophy or mythology as a true religion or a religion in which one can be saved. What they teach is that some of these anti-church fathers taught this, and even some of the scholastics, that the Greek philosophy was inspired by God. It was a true religion that can save people, equal to Judaism. God was working through the Jews with the law and the Greeks with wisdom. We went over that in my last lecture on the Hellenization of Christianity by the anti-church fathers. I'm not going to go too much in detail on that here. We already proved that philosophy is a false religion, okay? So anybody that teaches that it's a true religion, he's an apostate, he's an idolater, all right? Now, some people didn't say it was a true religion. Other people said, well, it's not a true religion, it's a false religion, but they can be saved in it. So while they're practicing it, believing in it, they can be saved. And that's putting it up on a pedestal, saying it's the saving religion. One guy that did that was the anti-church father Justin Martyr. Where in his first apology, which he wrote in 151, he said, "We have been taught that Christ is the firstborn of God, and we have declared above that he is the Word, of whom every race of men were partakers, and those who lived reasonably are Christians, even though they have been thought atheists, as among the Greeks, Socrates and Heracles, and men like them." So now he's telling you that Socrates and Heracles were saved because they were reasonable, they lived by reason, and they were saved. He didn't say their philosophy saved them, but they were saved while they were practicing and believing in their philosophy because they lived reasonably and according to the natural law. That's heresy. I went into that in more detail on my lecture last year. Anti-church father Clement of Alexandria taught the same thing. Here he teaches that the Greek philosophy is a true religion. Here he teaches this in his Stromata, and it was written in 208. And he says, before the advent of the Lord, philosophy was necessary to the Greeks for justification. It was a true religion. God gave that to them, and that's how they were justified. God was working through that religion. That's what he's saying. And that he whom we call Savior and Lord is the Son of God. It is he who gave also philosophy to the Greeks by the means of inferior angels. Here he is teaching that philosophy, the Greek philosophies, they're They're false religions are true religions, and Justin Martyr taught that they can save them while they're practicing those false religions. Lactantius taught the same thing. We're going to read here about the scholastic Roger Bacon. This is from a history of the church by the apostate Reverend Philip Hughes. Roger Bacon, too, was a Franciscan, an apostate Franciscan. He explains how all knowledge of natural things as well as of what is sacred has descended to us. The Hebrew prophets and the Greek philosophers played similar roles in the divine plan. The philosophers were the successors of the prophets. They were themselves prophets. That's Roger Bacon. Now, that's just one scholastic. Other scholastics held this also. I'm not going to go into detail how it's a false religion. We already did that already. That guy's justifying a false religion. He's an idolater. You're not just a heretic, by the way, folks. That's why I call them apostates. You're an apostate. If you're an idolater, I call you an apostate. That's a total repudiation of Christianity altogether. It's worse than even being a heretic. So when you say that these Greek philosophies are true religions or you can be saved in them, you're an apostate. And many of them taught, my book has a lot of evidence on this. I'm only giving you a little bit right here. Now we're going to go over the second category in this here, which is B. They present philosophy or mythology as necessary or useful to better understand Christianity. Now, not all of them taught that you can be saved by practicing Greek philosophy, or not all of them taught that Greek philosophy was a true religion, but a lot of them, if not all of them, actually taught this. All the scholastics did, and the Hellenizing anti-church fathers taught this, that it's very good and useful to study the philosophical works of the Greek pagans, their philosophies, in order to better understand Christianity. So what they're saying there is that God Almighty himself has not taught us everything we need to know, nor clearly enough, but we got to go to the Greek philosophers. They're going to really put the icing on the cake for us. That's an abomination. That's also mixing the philosophy with theology. And they're telling you that you need to go to it. That's also apostasy. This is also idolatry. That's like saying I need to go to Satan so he can explain to me what Christ meant when he was teaching. It's exactly the same. And they all believed in this, all the scholastics and all the Hellenizing anti-church fathers. We're going to now give you a quote here from church history by the apostate Father John Lau. And it says, during the early Middle Ages, the theologians of the church had been content to assimilate the teachings of the fathers. Beginning with the dawn of the 12th century, a great change took place. Questions of philosophy and theology occupied the leading minds in every land. New ways were sought by which to penetrate more deeply into the truths of revelation. Instead of repeating over and over again the opinions handed down from antiquity, he says opinions, those are dogmas. They were getting bored with the dogmas is what's really happening here. Determined efforts were made to throw light on the doctrines of the church with the aid of Greek philosophy, especially that of Aristotle. He's going to enlighten us up and teach us dogmas the way no one ever taught him before. No one in the Old Testament, no one in the New Testament, not Jesus Christ himself. Aristotle is going to teach us. All the people before that were not as enlightened as they are because they're now depending upon the Greek philosophers to put the icing on the cake on our dogmas. That's what he's teaching here. We read from Europe, from the Renaissance and the Waterloo by Robert Ergang. Since the content of this classical literature was pagan, it was regarded by many leading churchmen as inimical to Christianity. But not all the churchmen repudiated the classics. Many continued to cherish them and sought to accommodate them to the essential teachings of the church. Socrates and Plato were made into precursors of Christianity, and the works of Aristotle were interpreted by Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas in such a fashion as to furnish a logical basis for Catholic theology. There you go. Those are your two famous theologians. Albert the Great Wretch and Thomas Aquinas. These are bastard apostates teaching that it's not only useful, it's even necessary for us to be able to teach most perfectly. Until they came along and we started using them, our dogmas are not perfectly defined. They did that to deny the dogmas. That's how you end up denying dogmas. Remember Hebrews 13, 8 to 11, I think, Jesus Christ yesterday, today, the same forever. Be not led astray by various and strange doctrines. A dogma is a dogma is a dogma. It doesn't change its meaning. These people are really actually changing its meaning by using these Greeks and holding on to their heresies and replacing the dogmas with the Greek pagans' heresies. Now we read Apostate Thomas of Aquinas teaching this in his Summa. And he's teaching this in his book 1, question 1, article 5, reply to objection 2. This science, theology, can in a sense depend upon the philosophical sciences. Not as though it stood in need of them, but only in order to make its teachings clearer. Now he would say, oh, you don't need them. Not everybody has to be a philosopher, no philosopher, but it will make the teachings clearer. It will be better to study them. Again, God cannot teach us well enough in his Catholic Church, sufficiently enough. Aristotle can teach us better. That's what he's saying. That's Jesus Christ, God's Holy Catholic Church, infallible papal decrees, ordinary magisterium dogmas by the true church fathers cannot teach us well enough. We got to go to Aristotle and Plato, pagans. This is so bad. Now we're going to read about this from the Scholastic Paulius Cortesius. This is from the History of Popes by apostate Dr. Ludwig Pastor. The most objectionable of these was the attempt to introduce the heathenism of the humanistic style into theological science. We find such an attempt in the Compendium of Dogma, published in 1503 by Paulus Cortesius, secretary to Alexander VI, the Borgia, anti-pope, apostate anti-pope. The latter, apostolical protonotary. Cortesius certainly takes his stand on the principles of the church and refutes the false conceptions of heathen philosophers, but he's convinced that Christian dogma cannot be rightly understood or explained without the aid of the wisdom of the ancient sages. I call so-called wisdom, I put in ancient sages. Thus the pagan garment in which he wraps his dogma is undoubtedly a source of peril. You need to study them to understand our dogmas more clearly. That's what he's saying. He pays lip service to the faith and to the dogmas, but he still says the pagan philosophers can help us to understand our dogmas better than our Christian theologians, better than God Almighty himself. Now we're going to call from apostate anti-pope Leo XIII in Eterni Patris. Paragraph 4, and he says, in the first place, philosophy, if rightly made use of by the wise in a certain way, tends to smooth and fortify the road to true faith. That's like saying we got to watch Star Trek or read Aesop's Fable before we can come to the scriptures. You know, it's the same thing. And to prepare the souls of its discipline for the fit reception of revelation. For what reason it is well called by the ancient writers sometimes a stepping stone to the Christian faith, sometimes the prelude and help of Christianity, sometimes the gospel teacher. Aristotle's going to teach us about the gospel. I get so angry at this, you know. If I had the guy here, I'll punch his face right out. I'll peel his skin off, I'll pour vinegar on him, send him back down to hell. That's how angry I get when I read stuff like this. It's almost like 2 + 2 = 4. He's saying 5, and everyone goes around and nods their head and say fine. Anybody who agrees with it has to be a philosopher at heart. Has to be a pagan philosopher, not a true Christian, if you agree with what he's saying here. This is basic dogma stuff. He says, who does not see that a plain and easy road is opened up to the faith by such method of philosophical study? How completely contrary that is to the true teachings of the church. Now, in that same encyclical, he takes two of St. Augustine's teachings out of context to defend his heresy. They always do this. They try to go back and get a true church father so they can sort of say it's resting on tradition, and they quote him out of context, or they misquote him, and to try to defend their own heresy. And I'm going to quote it, and I'm going to make a comment on it. The first thing he does, where he makes a mistake, he's talking about St. Augustine, and St. Augustine basically says this, and I'm going to read it for you in a minute. St. Augustine said that reason is definitely necessary for things we can understand by reason. And it's even necessary as a precursor to some of the things that we can understand in our dogma. So reason is something, reason St. Augustine's talking about, not philosophy. He's just talking about the use of your reason. He tries to pin this in with, well, then he means that's philosophy. We can study Aristotle and Plato because they used reason and their works are reasonable. And we can use, that's he's trying to pin that statement in. The second thing he tries to do is he uses St. Augustine's teaching out of context, which he says we can take the gold and silver out of Egypt, meaning that there's some good things that are inside philosophy that when you convert, you still keep those things. You don't lose them. But we're going to explain it as we go along here. Number one, he equates the use of reason with philosophy. Apostate to Pope Leo XIII in his Eterni Patris. He says, therefore, divine providence itself requires that in calling back the people to the paths of faith and salvation, advantage should be taken of the human science also, and approved in wise practice, which history testifies was observed by the most illustrious fathers of the church. they indeed were wont neither to belittle nor undervalue the part that reason had to play, as it's summoned up by the great Augustine when he attributes to the science, that by which the most wholesome faith is begotten, is nourished, defended, and made strong. The use of reason, logic, fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not philosophy. He's not saying go out and study Aristotle's philosophy or Plato's philosophy. He's talking about the use of reason and logic, which we all agree with, is something that we must use and align with their faith to things that we can reasonably understand. That's not saying and condoning the teaching of the philosophical works of the Greeks. I'm going to show you too when I quote from St. Augustine. Here I say St. Augustine teaches the importance of reason in relation to the Catholic faith and places it second to the faith, but he does not glorify philosophy as Leo XIII would have you believe. Surely not everyone who has a use of reason uses it as a philosopher. So that's he teaches that. Now the worst part he teaches in here is he's saying that St. Augustine, about the gold out of Egypt. Apostate Pope Leo XIII also takes St. Augustine's below teaching out of context. He wants you to believe that St. Augustine is teaching that Greeks who converted to Catholicism must or should continue to learn about the faith and morals from the Greek philosophers. When he says the gold and the silver that's taken from Egypt. First, we're going to quote from Apostate Pope Leo XIII, his Eterni Patris. Paragraph 4. St. Augustine says, do we not see Cyprian, that mildest of doctors and most blessed of martyrs, going out of Egypt laden with gold and silver investments? And he used that to say, that's why we continue to study the Greek philosophers, because they have a lot of gold and a lot of silver, and we can get a lot of good stuff from them, so we continue to learn it. That's not what St. Augustine was saying. What he was saying was when somebody converts from paganism, there's going to be certain truths in their philosophies, even in Hinduism or Buddhism. You don't throw those truths out. Every religion, false religion, has a few truths in it. What he's saying is you take those truths now, I'm going to explain and quote it to you. You take those truths from that false religion, you bring it into Catholicism, and now you can most perfectly understand them because the people that you got it from had unlawful possession of them. That's what he says. He says the Greeks have unlawful possession of these truths. You now take these, bring them into Catholicism, and Catholicism perfects them. He doesn't say go back and continue to keep studying from the Greek pagan philosophers to pick out the gold and silver. And why do you not need to go back? For first of all, the few truths they have, of course you're going to keep those truths. But the Catholic Church has all the gold and silver you need. You don't need to go back there and be picking on other gold and silver. So I'm going to read St. Augustine. He's trying to make you believe St. Augustine's telling you that you can go back and continue to study these people. Now this is St. Augustine on Christian doctrine, which he wrote in 395, paragraph 60 and 61. Moreover, if those who are called philosophers, and especially the Platonists, have said aught that is true and in harmony with our faith, we are not only to shrink from it, but to claim it for our own use from those who have unlawful possession of it right away. Of course, it's true. It's still true even now that you're a Christian, but they had unlawful possession of it. We still believe in it. Now we're bringing it into our faith. For as the Egyptians had not only the idols and heavy burdens which the people of Israel hated and fled from, but also vessels and ornaments of gold and silver and garments, which the same people, when going out of Egypt, appropriated to themselves, designating them for a better use in Catholicism, not doing this on their own authority, but by the command of God, the Egyptians themselves in their ignorance, providing them with things which they themselves were not making good use of it. So he's saying the Egyptians, the pagan philosophers, are not making good use of these truths. You bring it into Catholicism, make good use of it, and perfectly understand it by Catholicism. In the same way, all branches of heathen learning have not only false and superstitious fancies and heavy burdens of unnecessary toil, which every one of us, when going out under the leadership of Christ from the fellowship of the heathen, ought to abhor and avoid. But they contain also liberal instruction, which is better adopted to the use of the truth, and some most excellent precepts of morality, and some truths in regard even to the worship of the one God are found among them. Now these are, so to speak, their gold and silver, which they did not create themselves, but dug out of the mines of God's providence, which are everywhere scattered abroad and are perversely and unlawfully prostituting to the worship of devils. So he's saying they have these things. Indeed they have them. All religions have some truths. I'll explain to you why as we go on here. He says, but they're prostituting to the worship of devils, and they cannot perfectly put them to use. These, therefore, the Christian, when he separates himself in spirit from the miserable fellowship of these men, ought to take away from them and to devote to their proper use in preaching the gospel. Their garments also, that is, human institutions such as are adopted to the intercourse with men, which is indispensable to this life, we must take and turn to Christian use. Take them. You don't throw out those truths. You now use them into Christianity, and now you can understand them more perfectly than before, and they're being to the redounding to the true God. You're the ones who now have lawful possession of it. That's what he's saying. He goes, and what else have many good and faithful men among our brethren done? Do we not see what a quantity of gold and silver and garments Cyprian, that most persuasive teacher, most blessed martyr, was loaded when he came out of Egypt? That's what he's telling you. And if you read Augustine's work through and through and throughout, as I quoted you before, he says we should not look to the philosophers about anything of religion at all. He said that, I quoted that earlier in this lecture. He says we should not listen to them about anything that has to do with religion. So this is what he's teaching, and it's common sense. When you convert and come out of a false religion, and they had a couple truths, you're not going to deny them, or you'd be a heretic. You take those truths with you, and you use them in Catholicism, and then they even make more sense now because you can see the wisdom of all those truths in combination with all the other gold and silver. He's not telling you to go back and continue to try to pull out gold and silver from these people and study their teachings. He teaches you the complete opposite. St. Augustine said many times, you cannot learn anything about religion from philosophy because the religion is false. So Leo XIII is trying to use his teaching in St. Augustine out of context to justify his telling people that you need to study philosophy to be enlightened and to be edified and to better understand Christianity. Now we read about, he's using that example, right, taking the gold and silver out of Egypt. Well, when the Israelites left Egypt with their gold and silver and they went into the promised land, any Israelite that tried to go back to Egypt was an apostate. And many of them did. They said, let's go back to Egypt. It's better back there. They have better food. And what did they say about them? We're going to read. If you tried, they didn't go back to continue to get more gold and silver. They left. They're gone. We got it. We're going to bring it to our use, and we're out of here. We're going to read about this in Numbers 14, chapter 14, verse 2 to 11. And all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron, saying, would God that we had died in Egypt, and would God we may die in the vast wilderness, and the Lord may not bring us into the land, lest we fall by the sword, and our wives and children are led away captives. Is it not better to return to into Egypt? And they said one to another, let us appoint a captain, and let us return unto Egypt. Leo XIII is telling you to go back to Egypt. Augustine says, don't go back to Egypt. He says, take the gold and silver to your use, but don't go back. Leo says, go back. But Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh said to all the multitude of the children of Israel, be not rebellious against the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will this people detract me? How long will they not believe me? For all the signs that I have wrought before them, they want to go back and continue to. You want to go back? Leo XIII wants to go back and continue to study the paganism from the Greek philosophers. Likewise, also St. Paul said that bear not the yoke with unbelievers, philosophers. For what participation hath justice with injustice? Or what fellowship hath light, Catholicism, with darkness, philosophy? And what concord hath Christ with Belial, philosophers? What part of the faithful of God with the unbeliever? And what agreement hath the temple of God with that of idols? Wherefore go out from amongst them and be separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, philosophy and philosophers. That's 2 Corinthians 6, 14 to 17. He's not telling you to go back and continue to study from them. That's a very important thing where Leo pulled a little fast curveball in here where they try to deceive you. Taking the great St. Augustine out of context. I have literally 10 or 20 quotations of St. Augustine telling you how you're not supposed to learn from it. They got nothing to offer us on faith or morals. On logic and reason, or dialectics, yes, as we went over the other day, but not under philosophical works, not when they're teaching about religion, not when they're teaching on faith and morals. Now, we go into the other, under this category C. They present philosophy or mythology as necessary or useful to live a moral and virtuous life. So we can learn how to be moral from the philosophers and virtuous. I went over that a lot last lecture, but I'm just briefly mention it here. Some of the philosophers were more moral than others. All of them taught some things that were moral, but they also taught a lot of things that were immoral. So when you take their teachings as a whole, 5 things that are moral, 5 things that are immoral. One guy might have taught 10 things that are moral, 3 things that are immoral. But the point is this. If you're not a Catholic and you're coming from a really bad Hinduan type religion that's totally immoral, and you went into philosophy, which is a little better, you'd see the guy's moving in the right direction, but he still hasn't found it. When you come into Catholicism, Catholicism has everything you need to know about how to be moral and virtuous. Why? Because it's God Almighty who's teaching you. It's God who put the natural law upon your heart. It's God who teaches through his Catholic Church. It's God who gave us the moral law. It's God who makes it possible for us to be virtuous. It's for a Catholic to say that I got to go back and start learning Aristotle and Plato on how to be moral and virtuous. Again, you're saying that the Catholic Church and God cannot teach you all the morals or teach you well enough. It's an insult to God. It's a smack in the face against God. It's a denial of God. And it's apostasy. Basil did that. Basil the Great Wretch did that. A lot of them do that, by the way. That's a very common thing amongst the Hellenizing anti-church followers and the Scholastics. A lot of them do that. That was in my last lecture. If you want to look, Jerome did the same thing. Apostate Jerome did the same thing. We got to go to these people to learn how to be moral and virtuous. We're reading here from St. Cyprian in his Treatise 9 on the advantage of patience, and he's talking about philosophers now and the virtue of patience. And he's saying philosophers also profess that they pursue this virtue, patience. But in their case, the patience is as false as their wisdom also is. For whence can he be either wise or patient, who has neither known the wisdom nor the patience of God? Wherefore, if the wisdom among them be not true, the patience also cannot be true. And he's teaching another truth. Even the morals and virtues they teach are false, because it's not redounded to the true God. It's mixed with falsehoods, and it's taught in a religion that gives glory to a false God. So he's saying even their virtues are false, because it's not redounding to the true God. It's not done with true motives. The motive behind it is not perfect. Their virtues are not true virtues. That's what Cyprian says. They're not even true virtues. St. Cyril of Jerusalem in his first catechetical lecture, lecture 4, he says, beware lest anyone spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the traditions of men, after the rudiments of the world. Vice mimics virtue, and the tares strive to be thought wheat, growing like the wheat in appearance, but being detected by good judges from the taste. The devil also transfigures himself into an angel of light. For the method of godliness consists of these two things: how to be moral and godly and virtuous, pious doctrines, Catholic dogma, which the Greeks don't have, and virtuous practices. You need both of those to be virtuous. And neither are doctrines acceptable to God apart from good works, nor does God accept the works which are not perfected with pious doctrines. So no matter how moral that these philosophers may have been in one or two areas, they didn't have the pious doctrines in the faith, so it's unacceptable to God. That's what he's saying. I repeat, he says that for the method of godliness consists of these two things: pious doctrines, the Catholic faith, and virtuous practice. And neither are the doctrines acceptable to God apart from good works. So even us who have the Catholic faith, if we don't do good works, we're in damnation and mortal sin. Nor does God accept the works which are not perfected with pious doctrines. For what profit is it to know well the doctrines concerning God and yet to be a vile fornicator? And again, what profit is it to be of a noble temperament and an impious blasphemer like the philosophers? They were blasphemers. They worshiped the false god. So that's what he's saying. What good are your virtues going to do you? Because you don't have the faith. You need to have both to be truly virtuous. That's St. Cyril of Jerusalem, church father. Now we're going to read from the church father, St. Ambrose, on his duties of the clergy. Paragraph 7. To be active in good works and unfaithful at heart is as idle as though wanted to raise a beautiful and lofty dome upon a bad foundation. This is the philosophers. They say we do good works, but they're unfaithful in their heart because their religion is false. The higher one builds, the greater is the fall. For without the protection of faith, good works cannot stand. A treacherous anchorage in a harbor perforates a ship, and a sandy bottom quickly gives way and cannot bear the weight of the building placed upon it. There then will be found the fullness of the reward, where the virtues are perfect and where there is reasonable agreement between words and acts. Only the Catholic faith can you be truly virtuous and truly moral. St. Augustine teaches this in the City of God. For when virtues are genuine virtues, and that is possible only when men believe in God. Only believers can have true virtues, see? Genuine virtues. They make no pretense of protecting their possessors from unhappiness, for that would be a false promise. See, some of the philosophers saying everything they cared about was to be happy. So when you're unhappy, something's wrong. But our faith teaches we're going to be persecuted at times we're going to be unhappy. We're going to be unhappy when we look at blasphemies against God, when people are sinning like crazy, when they persecute us. So he says, he's telling you basically, don't listen to these philosophers. The apostle St. Paul was not speaking of men lacking prudence, fortitude, temperance, and justice, but of men whose virtues were true virtues, because the men were living by faith. You can only have true virtues if you live by faith. The Catholic faith. Again, St. Augustine is saying, you can't have true virtue outside unless you're a believer. And therefore the Greek philosophers do not have true virtues. Pope St. Gregory the Great in his Moralia, book 18 teaches, paragraph 87, and observe that when he said above, nor shall it be compared to the dyed colors of India, those same colors he did not bring in pure, but in this place that he might distinguish the dye of true virtues from the staining of the philosophers. The philosophers do not have true virtues. Pope St. Gregory the Great. So anybody wants to say we got to go and learn how to be virtuous and moral by them is condemning these ordinary magisterial teachings by these church fathers. It also was infallibly defined by popes, and it's part of the natural law. Now this is part D. They use philosophy as a source of revelation on faith or morals. So what they do is they go and they look at what Aristotle taught or Plato taught about faith and morals, about religious topics, and they go, wow, let me figure out this revelation and see if it's true. Let me try to work it and meld it in with Christianity. Or even a lot of them did this. They said, look, Aristotle taught us better than the Catholic faith did. So they ended up believing Aristotle's revelations and denying the Catholic Church's revelations. Aquinas was big on that. When you look at his Summa, he's talking about the philosopher, and he capitalizes with a big P, idolizing Aristotle. He's always talking about what Aristotle taught. Hey, look what Aristotle taught. Let's conform our minds to what Aristotle taught. He uses him as authority to bind you to it, and he got into trouble. That's how come he fell into many heresies. One of the heresies he fell into by following Aristotle was, and not just Aristotle, but a lot of the philosophers believed that God created the world eternal, which means that even though the world was created, it always existed. So it was never made. So wait a second, how could God create something and it always existed? So evidently, I think they did say it was made, but it always existed. It's contrary. Now, this was condemned, first of all, by the Solemn Magisterium. First of all, they condemned because God tells us, and now Thomas didn't believe the world was created eternal and always existed, because he said the Bible tells us that it didn't always exist. But what he taught was God could have created a world that always existed, but then that world would have to be co-eternal with God. And that's against dogma, because a dogma is God says in the beginning was only God and God alone and nothing else. So if the world always existed, he's denying that dogma that God is the only one that could have always existed. So what he did is he took the revelations of these philosophers and he believed it. He believed that God could have created a world at the same time it would have always existed. He believed it. He extrapolated on it in his article, Aeternitate Mundi. And then he was mocking people who didn't believe it. And he said, you mean to tell me that you're not going to believe this when all the noble and great philosophers believed it? So what's he doing? Where did he get this revelation from? Did it come from the Bible? The Bible condemns it. The Bible condemns him. God says, I'm the only God, I'm the only one who always existed. Besides me, there is no other God, and there was no other God, and nothing is co-eternal but me. That's in the Bible. The Bible condemns what he taught. He got it from Aristotle. He got it from Plato. I think Plato taught it too. He got it from all the philosophers. That's what we're saying here. And that's just one example. They denied dogmas on original sin, on the nature of the Holy Trinity, on the Holy Eucharist, because they would go and they would look what Aristotle taught about faith and morals, and they were obsessed with it, as if it was a revelation come down from God. And they would sometimes even try to reconcile with Catholic dogma to make Aristotle look better than he was. And they got into all kinds of trouble doing this. We're going to again read this quote from church history by apostate Father John Lau. And he says, beginning with the dawn of the 12th century, a great change took place. Questions on philosophy and theology occupied the leading minds in every land. New ways were sought by which to penetrate more deeply into the truths of revelation. And they went to Aristotle and Plato to get these revelations. Instead of repeating over and over again the opinions handed down from antiquity to dogmas, determined efforts were made to throw light on the doctrines of the church with the aid of Greek philosophy, especially of Aristotle. He's saying that's where they're now going to get some revelations. These are new stuff that we didn't get. Boy, this is neat. We're going to start getting our revelations from them. Now we're going to read from the history of the Christian church in the Middle Ages by Philip Smith. The medieval schoolmen started with the assumption that all which the church in their own day held and taught, all the accretions and additions to the pure faith of Christ, which in successive ages had attached themselves to it, formed a part of the original truth once delivered, or it had become no less sacred than that was, and were as such to be justified and defended. But with all this profound submission to the authority of the church, he's saying all the scholastics said, we do believe tradition, everything that's handed down. That's all he said in that first paragraph. They pay lip service to tradition. But with all this profound submission to the authority of the church, the schoolmen themselves, in the whole principles and process of their intellectual activity, in its service, were unconsciously vindicating and preparing the coming age of emancipation from the bonds with which they still consented to wear. They were breaking the bonds of tradition, the ordinary solemn magisterium, by now bringing in the revelations of the philosophers. This character of their work is well described by Dean Milman. Quote, "It was an extraordinary fact that in such an age when Latin Christianity might seem at the height of its medieval splendor and power, the age of chivalry, of cathedral and monastic architecture, of poetry in its romantic and religious forms, so many powerful intellects should be incessantly busy with metaphysics of religion." That's the philosophical works of Aristotle, Plato, and the philosopher. Should be busy with the metaphysics of religion, not as taught by authority, but religion under philosophic guidance, with the aid, they might presume to say, with the compulsory aid of the pagan Aristotle and the Mohammedan Arabs. The Mohammedan Arabs brought in this philosophy, Aristotle also, and they were studying their translations of philosophy. But still with Aristotle and the Arabians admitted to the honor of a hearing, not regarded as odious, impious, and godless, but listened to with respect, discussed with freedom, refuted with confessed difficulty. With all its seemingly outward submission to authority, scholasticism at last was a tacit universal insurrection against authority. Perfect. That says it in a nutshell right there. They were now bringing in these other revelations that were undermining the very authority that they paid lip service to. We read about this also in the Heretics and Scholars in the Middle Ages of 1000 to 1200 by Heinrich Frichenau. In addition to the growing self-assurance felt by scholars, another factor that contributed to declining respect for the Christian authorities was the broadening of intellectual horizons brought about by the growing familiarity with the ancient philosophers. Disputants had no scruples about using opinions of pagan philosophers as their auctoritates, which is as their authority, as their authorities. Bernard Silvestris even included poets, pagan and ancient Christians, among the auctores, the authorities. Those men possessing authority, since the poets are the ones who introduce us to philosophy. No one raised an eyebrow at this, for people already imputed to Virgil's work a deeper Christian meaning and had a penchant for quoting Ovid out of a high regard for the moralistic content of his poems. Of course, there were those who heartily despised the pagan poets and philosophers. Yes, the very few, to their credit, wherever they might be, but it was very few. And anyone that really opposed it the right way, we're not even going to know who they were. They'd either kill them or cast them out into a mountain somewhere, and they're not going to even be able to teach or talk or be priests. Now we also read here from a history of the church by apostate Reverend Philip Hughes. Very early in the 12th century, it began to be rumored everywhere that long before Christianity was heard of, Aristotle had solved all the problems of human society. Right? These are the people that had to believe that Aristotle's religion was a true religion. And God was, it's even better than Christianity. Even when Christianity came along, it did not. We even teach that the New Testament perfected the Old Testament. He's teaching Aristotle was even better than Christianity. Look, okay? By the end of the century, it was much more than rumor. And here we touch on the core of the new revolution in travail. The genius of Aristotle himself. When the Catholic West began to read for the first time his physics, the De Cielo et Mundi, the De Anima, the De Generatione et Corruptione, and the metaphysics, which is all this is his philosophical works, it reeled before the sudden discovery of a new world. Look at these new things opening to us. Here was the systematic study of the universe, a whole corpus of new facts, and a philosophy that explained them. It was a kind of sudden revelation on the natural order. Again, see, they're going here to get their these are these new revelations that are coming from the philosophers. And overall, there presided the genius of the inventor of logic, It was the key to the universe and the study of the universe. The first effect, inevitably, was a confusion of sudden conclusions and half-truths. For the ruling authorities in the church, it presented an anxious problem, this vast corpus of knowledge, a knowledge shot through with materialism, pantheism, and all that was least compatible with the traditional faith, full of all kinds of heresies. But he's saying they're now going to these people for these new revelations, these scholastics, and they're trying to incorporate them into Christianity. All right, now we're going to give three. Now, some people might say, well, there's some things that the Greeks taught that were true about revelation, about supernatural revelations, even about the flood, or about certain things about the faith that they have on hold of. And we're going to say there's three reasons why they have certain truths about the faith. Three reasons. The first reason is they know these revelations because their false religions retained them as handed down from their ancestors who at one time were believers. After all men trace their line back to the believer Noah, who in turn traces his line back to the believer Adam. So they retain some of these truths in their false religions. All these false religions teach some supernatural dogmas because they didn't get rid of them all, about the flood and other things. 2, they know these revelations from their false prophets or false seers, such as the pagan Sibyl, which God allows for several reasons, such as in order to prepare them for conversion, or to condemn them, or for the benefit of others. So a lot of times he lets them profess the truth, either to prepare them for conversion, or to condemn them, or for the benefit of others. So they have these truths through their pagan seers. 3, they know these revelations because they stole them from the one true religion, such as Judaism during the Old Covenant era and Catholicism from the New Covenant era, which they had knowledge of. This is big because they came way after the prophets and everything, these philosophers. Moses and Abraham came way before them, and they all knew the Judaism. They all knew about it. They all knew what it taught. They were envious of it. They were jealous of it. They didn't like it, but they borrowed some of these truths as properly taught. They say they stole them from the true religion and incorporated them into their own. So that's why they also have some supernatural dogmas in their religion, because they stole them from the true religion and again have unlawful possession of them. We read about this from the apostate Justin Martyr in his first apology, chapter 44. For Moses is more ancient than all the Greek writers, and whatever both philosophers and poets have said concerning the immortality of the soul, or punishments after death, or contemplation of things heavenly, or doctrines of the like kind, they have received such suggestions from the prophets as have enabled them to understand and interpret these things. And hence there seem to be seeds of truth among all men, but they are charged with not accurately understanding the truth when they assert contradictories. St. Augustine teaches about this in his reply to Faustus the Manichaean, book 12, paragraph 15. If any truth about God or the Son of God is taught or predicted in a Sibyl or Sibyls or in the Orpheus or in Hermes, if there ever was such a person, or in any other heathen poets or theologians or sages or philosophers, it may be useful for the refutation of pagan errors, but cannot lead us to believe in these writers. For while they spoke because they could not help it, of God whom we worship, they either taught their fellow countrymen to worship idols and demons, or allowed them to do so without daring to protest against it. So even though they have some of these truths, they have a lot of untruths that are horribly and against the faith, and they don't have the true faith. And that's how come they have certain revelations that are true. But the Catholic Church has all the revelations and dogmas that are true. You don't need to get them from anybody once you're a Catholic. To say you got to go back to these people that are worshiping a false God and practicing a false religion is idolatry and apostasy. And the last in this category I said, which was E, by loving or at least liking philosophy or mythology. I say this for the want of any other word, but anybody who reads the philosophical works and they like it or love it, they're an idolater. There's no way you can like or love these things if you have the Catholic faith. You abhor them, or you laugh at them, or you might say, well, he was right here, but he's wrong over, he's foolish. You don't need it. The Catholic faith puts all these things together so perfectly, these guys are incompetent, they're fools. We read in Matthew 6:21, for where thy heart is, there is thy treasure also. So if you like or you love philosophical works, that's like saying, I like or love Islam. I like or love Buddhism. I like or love Hinduism. I like or love Aristotle's philosophical works. That's saying I like or love a false religion. You're an idolater. You're not a Catholic. You deny the faith. You know that for certain people when just by the way they're talking, how they're enamored by it. We read also in Luke 6:45, a good man out of the good treasure of his heart bringeth forth that which is good. An evil man out of the evil treasure bringeth forth that which is evil. For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaketh. So if you like or at least love the philosophical works of these Greeks, you're an idolater and apostate. We're now going to talk about the second way in which philosophy is glorified, the second way, which is by using the unique methods of philosophy. And this has several different categories. The first category, which is 2A, is by emphasizing questions and not answers. The only reason they really want to have an answer is so they can have another question. And we're going to quote this. St. Jesus, son of Sirach, in the Bible condemns these philosophers and scholastics as having entangled themselves in an infinity of questions. St. Paul says, do not give heed to fables which furnish questions rather than the edification of God which is in faith. Now the end of the commandment is charity from a pure heart and a good conscience and an unfeigned faith, from which things some going astray are turned aside unto vain babbling, desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither the things they say nor whereof they affirm. That's 1 Timothy 1:4-7. And we read from the History of the Christian Church by Philip Schaff. Another name which may be introduced here is Walter of St. Victor. And as I said before, I think he's good. He said a lot of good things, this Walter of St. Victor, who is chiefly known by the characterization of Abelhard Gilbert of Poitiers, Peter the Lombard, and the Lombard's pupil, Peter of Poitiers, afterwards Chancellor of the University of Paris, as the four labyrinths of France. He likened the reasoning to the garrulity of frogs, rarum garrulitas, and declared that as sophists they had unsettled the faith by their questions and counter-questions. Questions on top of questions. We read also from the ancient philosophical legacy in its transmission to the Middle Ages by Charles H. Lord. He says in the 12th century, the interpreter, having abandoned the notion of truth possessed for the notion of truth to be sought, could approach the text of the philosopher in a critical, questioning way. Behind this revolution lay, no doubt, the de facto conflicts between Aristotle's teachings and the doctrines of faith. The philosophical procedure made it possible for the masters of arts to turn increasingly from the exposition to the question form of commentary. We read a quote from St. Hilary of Poitiers on the Trinity, Book 12, paragraph 19. Now, first of all, men professing a devout knowledge of divine things in matters where the truth preached by evangelists and apostles showed the way, ought to have laid aside the intricate questions of a crafty philosophy, and rather to have followed after the faith which rests in God, because the sophistry of a syllogistical question easily disarms a weak understanding of the protection of its faith, since treacherous assertion lowers on the guileless defender who tries to support his case by inquiry into facts, till at last it robs him by means of his own inquiry of his certainty, so that the answer no longer remains in the consciousness a truth which by his admission he has surrendered. So you end up even questioning the dogmas you believe in, because they want everything to revert back to a question. They don't ultimately want definitive answers. We read from the History of Popes by the apostate Louis Pasteur. The most earnest of these men lamented, among other evils, the extravagances with which some of their brethren allowed themselves in their discourses. We hear of preachers whose sermons are overcharged with vain learning or full of hair-splitting theological questions. And then we read from the History of the Christian Church during the Middle Ages by Philip Smith. The exact place occupied by Aristotle in scholasticism is described by Professor Brewer. He adds some excellent remarks on the results produced by the scholastic use of Aristotle, the chief being, in great precision of their method, the exaggeration of which, in its turn, to their great fault of attempting to state every question and a set of definite propositions, with solutions which often have the question more involved than it was before, the solution being not only unproved, but suggestive of new doubts and questions, involved in infinite series of questions. Questions, questions, questions. One of the reasons that they want to always have questions is, and St. Paul tells us this when he went to Athens, is because the philosophers are always seeking for new things. They always want to have new things. So if you had definitive dogma, debate-ending questions, there's no longer any new things to talk about. And so they're always looking for something new. St. Paul says this in the book of Acts 17, verse 18 and 21. Verse 18 and verse 21. And certain philosophers of the Epicureans and of the Stoics disputed with him. Now all the Athenians and strangers that were there employed themselves in nothing else but either in telling or in hearing something new. So of course, if you have an answer to all your questions, there's nothing new anymore, right? The apostate John Gerson in his letter 2 talks about this, and this was in 1400, how at the University of Paris they were always looking for something new. He says, how small is the hope of doing any good among those who are wise in their own eyes, theologians at the University of Paris, and who take time out for nothing except with the Athenians to speak or to hear anything that is new. Now, even though he was an apostate, but he did give some very good testimonies about the crimes that were being committed in the University of Paris, and he was the chancellor, so he should know. There's certain parts of scholasticism he didn't like, and there's other parts that he did. Now, he also wrote, apostate John Gerson, in his letter 5 in 1400, there are those who by all kinds of trifles and clumsy novelties clutter up parchment in the minds of listeners. They fill them with sterile cockles, if only they were not also diseased, of their doctrines, and burden the stomach of memory, not with food but with husks. They sow the field of the heart with thorns rather than with grain. They also complain that it is wretched to use what already has been discovered, dogmas. It's wretched to keep repeating the dogmas and never to be able to discover anything new. How much wiser it would be to make use of what already has been well invented than rather to invent what is sought for. Why should one try to produce such things and undermining what already has been made? And that's what they end up doing, undermining the dogmas, because they don't like dogmas, because it ends the debate. It ends their ability to search for new things. The main sin of the philosopher and scholastics is intellectual pride, which idolizes the brain. After all, if he accepted a true answer, then he would no longer be able to exercise his brain power and show how much smarter he is than you and you and you and you. He can say, I'm smarter not only than all his current people, but even all the church fathers. I'm going to come up with some new stuff you guys never heard before. So they want to exercise their intellectual ability and show how much smarter they are than the next guy. And of course, if you come up with the debate-ending questions, there's no more, there's nothing more to say about it. So they always want to exercise their intellect to show you how much smarter they are than the next guy. As a result, St. Paul teaches what happens to these people who are always really producing questions and not really looking for answers, right? Look at your philosophers, look at your scholastics. They never, ever come up with the truth. They never possess the truth. They all admit it, too. A lot of your I think all your philosophers, sometime in their life said, I really don't have the truth. I'm not sure. I don't really have it. I don't know if what I'm saying is really true or not. I think everything I taught is false, or at least part of it is false. I don't have the whole truth. Plato, Aristotle, they all admitted this in their own lifetime, that they never really possessed the truth. And St. Paul speaks about these philosophers and scholastics in 2 Timothy 3:7. They're ever learning and never attaining to the knowledge of the truth. But they're ever learning. They want to exercise their brains and look for new things, but they really don't want the truth. We read about this from the book Heretics and Scholars in the Middle Ages, 1000 to 1200, by Hendrik Friedenau. After an absence of 10 years, the apostate, I put that in there, the apostate, John of Salisbury, although he says some good things here, returned to find his former Parisian colleagues debating the same old questions. He concluded that while dialectic might be a useful tool for other disciplines, it was in and of itself bloodless and sterile. John cited the words of St. Paul. They are always studying and never arrive at the knowledge of the truth. They speak nonsense and wish to be scholars. Some of the modern dialecticians favored subtleties over reality, offered proofs for foregone conclusions, and in many instances possessed no sense of what was essential. The field was overwhelmed by innumerable specialized questions, and the students spent their time solving riddles. This was particularly true during the second half of the 12th century, following a peak in the discipline's revival. Now, in the scriptures, St. Jesus, son of Cyril, teaches us that a true theologian, when he's searching for something like an allowable opinion, a legitimate solution, he's looking for an answer. He wants to clear it up. He wants to give you a definitive, dogmatic, debate-ending answer. He doesn't want to continue on questions. He deals with questions, but his whole goal is to come up with the truth. We read about this in Ecclesiasticus 33, 4-5. He that cleareth up a question shall prepare what to say, and so having prayed, he shall be heard, and shall keep discipline, and then he shall answer. The heart of a fool, though, is like a wheel of a cart, and his thoughts are like the rolling axle tree. More questions, never content, he keeps going. And even now and then, when they'll come up with the truth and they'll say, I finally have it, a week later, he doesn't have it anymore. And when you're reading his works, you think he has the truth. Then he denies it over here and he doesn't have it. Then he says, maybe I have it. Then he says, I do have it. Then he says, I don't have it. These are all methods that go along with your philosophers and scholastics. And also in the book of Proverbs, it also teaches, do not debate with these men. Do not try to fight with them on their own heretical methods and their own philosophical methods. Do not try to do that, because then you're going to lower yourself to them and you're going to commit sins yourself. But read about this in Proverbs 29:9. If a wise man contend with a fool, whether he be angry or laugh, he shall find no rest. You'll find no rest, because there is no solution. You're arguing with a guy, first of all, who doesn't really care about the truth. All he wants to do is produce a question and confound you. A Catholic should never debate about, if another so-called Catholic comes up to a Catholic and denies a dogma, the first thing is you call him a heretic. If he doesn't repent of it, there's no debating the guy. He either accepts the dogma or he doesn't. You can debate non-Catholics about things they don't understand, but a Catholic, if he calls himself a Catholic and he comes up to you and says he denies any dogma, there's no debate necessary. You show him the dogma, bind him to it, he doesn't accept it, he's a heretic. You can explain dogmas to Catholics as long as they believe in them, but the minute they start doubting or denying dogmas, there's no debate. Scholastics love to draw you into the debate, and you're going back and forth. You're lending credence to his false opinion, his heresy. You're giving credence to it by debating him. Something that's already been resolved by the church fathers or the ordinary magisterium, which is unanimous consensus of the church fathers, or by solemn definitions from the Pope, which is the solemn magisterium. One of the roots to these things, too, is with the result of this always wanting to have questions, always wanting to have new things, always wanting to show off how smart they are, is they love to debate and they love to argue, and thus they cause discord. They love to debate and argue, because if you had the truth and I thought I'm smarter than you, I'm going to come up with a different truth, which contradicts what you said, you see? And then another guy's going to come up with another so-called truth that contradicts what both of us said, because he wants to be smarter than both of us. In the end, they argue and they debate and they love it. They have like little competitions where they debate and see who's the better debater, who's the better arguer, and that develops into envies and jealousies. And these universities, it's a cesspool of iniquity. The Romans 1 curse is running through the University of Paris and all these universities that were using these methods because they were denying the faith. God put them under the Romans 1 curse, and they were committing gross sins of immorality. And you're looking at the churches too, the end result of the desecration of churches too, which is taking place all together at the same time as this. We read about how they love. In Proverbs 17:19, he that studieth discords loveth quarrels, and he that exalteth his door seeketh ruin. The philosopher, the scholastic, is infected with intellectual pride and thus exalts his door, his mouth, and thus loves discord, quarrels, and contentions. Quote, among the proud there are always contentions, Proverbs 13:10. God curses the philosophers and scholastics for many reasons, one of which is for the love of debate, dissension, argument, and quarrels. Quote, an evil man seeketh quarrels, but a cruel angel shall be sent against him. Proverbs 17:11. And St. Ambrose says in his book, The Sacrament of the Incarnation of our Lord in the 4th century, chapter 9, paragraph 89. The manner of the dialecticians demand that it be granted them to take as read what has not been read. Hence they disclose that they are being distracted by a zeal for contention, that they are not seeking knowledge of the truth. For in dialectics, if that is not conceded, which they demand be conceded to them, in which they desire to find an approach to contention, they cannot find a beginning of disputing. And this is true here, where there is a contention more about the subtleties of argument than about the consideration of truth. They love arguments more than they care about the truth, is basically what he's saying here. Now, there's a good dialectics and a bad one. When they speak about this anti-dialecticians, they're talking about the false dialectics, which is used to deny the truth and to deceive people. For this is the glory of the dialecticians, if they seem to overpower and refute the truth with words. On the other hand, the definition of faith is that truth, not words, be weighed. Finally, the simple truth of the fisherman excludes words of philosophers. And that was St. Ambrose. Again, we read St. Paul says the main emphasis is questions and not answers with the scholastics and philosophers because they want to exalt their intellect and cause discord, contentions, dissensions, and strifes. 1 Timothy 6, 3-5. If any man teach otherwise and consent not to the sound words of our Lord Jesus Christ and to that doctrine which is according to godliness, he is proud, knowing nothing, but sick about questions and strifes of words, from which arise envies, contentions, blasphemies, evil suspicions, conflicts of men corrupted in mind, and who are destitute of the truth, supposing gain for godliness. This is what was going on in universities. And you can imagine the pride of these students, that when they would get up and debate, and they would give them these riddles, and they would see who's the better debater. And as they say, whoever wins the debate doesn't necessarily always have the truth. He could be very sneaky in the way he uses his words. The guy who won the debate, they could say, lost the debate, could have the truth, but the guy who won it because he was using the false dialectics and false rhetoric and twisting people's words could seem to have won the debate. Maybe a better speaker even. But that doesn't mean he has the truth. And so they put their stock, and the whole thing is they really didn't want to have the truth anyway because it would end all the debating. As I said, as long as they have questions, they can continue to debate endlessly, and this allows them to show off their intellect and their brain power. They are not really interested in definitive debate-ending answers. We read from the Nominal Catholic Encyclopedia on Peter Lombard, the apostate. The want of originality and the refusal of the magister, that's what they call him, the master, to decide upon many points between two solutions were very favorable to the work of the masters who comment upon him. He would refuse to give his solution. He would give you, this is what he believed in, this is what he believed, and he would do this about heresies and dogmas. And this is what he believed. He'd give you 3 opinions, and he wouldn't say which is true, and he wouldn't say which he believes in. So you're free to pick whatever you want. Endless questions off of that. You can endless. And when it comes to dogmas and heresies, you cannot present them as something that's an allowable opinion in which you allow people to choose whatever they want. You have to present a dogma as a dogma and a heresy as a heresy. We're going to get into all these methods as we go on here. But you see here, because he didn't give any of his own solutions and presented 3 different opinions, they're all open for debate. And let's say if you're talking about an allowable opinion, where it's not a dogma, it's not a heresy, all right? And I present 3 of the legitimate allowable opinions. You can do that. But I still, if I'm writing about it, I'm going to present my opinion. And I'm going to say, out of these 3, this is what I believe in, I'm going to give you my reasons. They won't even give you the reason, what they believe in. They would just present all 3 and leave it up to you to even try to figure out. So even when you're dealing with allowable opinions, in which you're allowed to present 3 or 4 different opinions, you're going to present your opinion. They won't even present their opinion a lot of the time. But when it comes to dogmas and heresies, you're not allowed to do that. Because dogmas and heresies are not allowable opinions. A dogma has to be believed no matter what. A heresy has to be condemned no matter what. It's totally false. So we were saying too, the scholastic is always looking for some debate on this point or another, and if he cannot find one, he makes one up. Hence, they even propose many foolish and forbidding questions that should not even be asked for the sake of the debate of provoking quarrels. We read in Proverbs 18:6-7, the lips of a fool provoke his quarrels. The mouth of a fool is his destruction, and his lips are the ruin of his soul. Titus 3:9, avoid foolish questions and contentions and strivings about the law, for they are unprofitable and vain. And in 1 Timothy 6:20, O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust. Avoid the profane novelties of words and oppositions of knowledge falsely so called. Or I quote from the History of Christian Church during the Middle Ages by Philip Smith. Equally curious and difficult are his, Apostate Aquinas' collection of academical discussions on difficult questions, entitled Quaestiones Disputate, and the smaller supplementary collection of the miscellaneous questions, Questiones Quodlibetales, what you please, which appear to have originated in the problems submitted to Thomas for solution by persons who desired to profit by his faculty for subtle argumentation, and deals with matters which for the most part may be pronounced as unedifying as they are certainly curious. Full of stuff like this with the scholastics. Their summas, book on top of book on top. Ask yourself, did the apostles walk around with a mountain of books? I mean, literally a mountain of summas? Do you need that much? No, Augustine did write a lot, some of the church fathers, and that was at least good writing. So I'm not really even against when you write a lot, but these summas are outrageously, and the methods and the techniques that they use and the stuff they talk about and the methods, which makes it really evil. Now we're going to call for the Council of Valence in 855, and this council was condemning teachings by John Scotus Regina, who was one of your early scholastics that didn't really succeed too much in the 9th century. He didn't get real famous, but he still was pretty bad, and they ended up condemning him here in Canon 1. They talk about the scholastic method that we're talking about here. It says, "We have faithfully and obediently heard that the doctor of the Gentiles warning in the faith and in truth. O Timothy, guard that which has been entrusted to you. Avoid the profane novelties of words and oppositions under the false name of knowledge, which some promising concerning the faith have destroyed." That's 2 Timothy 6:20. And again, quote, "Shun profane and useless talk, for they contribute much toward ungodliness, and their speech spreadeth like an ulcer." 2 Timothy 2:16. And again, quote, "Avoid foolish and unlearned questions, knowing that they beget strifes, but the servant of the Lord must not quarrel." 2 Timothy 2:23. And again, "Nothing through contention, nothing through vainglory." Philippians 2:3. "Desire to be zealous for peace and charity, and so far as God has given, attending the pious counsels of the same apostle," quote, "solicitous to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace." Ephesians 4:3. "Let us with all zeal avoid novel doctrines and presumptuous talkativeness, whence rather the smoke of contention and of scandal between brothers can be stirred up, than any increase of the fear of God arise. Without hesitation, however, to the doctors piously and correctly discussing the word of truth, and to those very clear expositors of sacred scripture, namely Cyprian, Hilary, Ambrose, Augustine, and others, living tranquilly in Catholic piety, we reverently and obediently submit our hearing and our understanding to the best of our ability. We embrace the things which they have written for our salvation." Now this gets back to the point I just mentioned just briefly before. When you have Catholics and you call yourself a Catholic, that you're saying, "I submit to all the dogmas of the Catholic Church without question. I don't doubt them, I don't question them, I believe in them." So if a Catholic comes up to you and he denies a dogma, you're not to debate him. You're to show him the dogma and to say either you believe it or you don't. If you don't, you're a heretic. And he might say, "Well, let me explain to you why I don't believe in it." Or "Let me explain to you why I doubt it." I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. This isn't up for debate. As a Catholic, when you came into the church, you said, "I'm going to believe in all the dogmas of the Catholic Church." The church fathers and the churches already resolved these things. They already went through their debates on these issues and settled it. We're not going to open it up again to a whole other debate. Either you accept it or you don't. And even things Catholics can believe by reason, dogmas they can believe by reason, they can reasonably figure out. That's not the first reason we believe it. The first reason we believe it is because the Catholic Church taught it, so it's by faith. Then reason can understand it, you can explain it by reason, and God wants you to do that. But the first reason we believe it is by faith, because the Catholic Church teaches it. I say here, once a doctrine has been sufficiently explained and infallibly defined as a dogma, Catholics are forbidden to redebate or re-question it. This, of course, is greatly displeasing to the philosophers, the Hellenistic anti-church fathers, the Scholastics, and other idolizers and heretics who love to bring in debates and questions when there is no need. We read from Pope St. Leo the Great, his letter 162 to Leo Augustus in the 5th century. "Seeing that besides your care for things temporal, you so perseveringly exercise a religious foresight in the service of what is divine and eternal, to wit, the Catholic faith, which alone gives life to, and alone inhallows mankind, may abide in the one confession, and the dissensions which spring from the variety of earthly opinions may be driven away, most glorious Emperor, from the solid rock on which the city of God is built. And these gifts of God will at last be granted us from him, if we be not found ungrateful for what has been vouchsafed, and as though what we have gained were naught. We seek not rather the very opposite. For to seek what has been discovered, dogmas, to reconsider what has been completed, dogmas, and to demolish what has been defined, dogmas, what else is it but to return no thanks for the things gained, and to indulge in unholy longings of deadly lust of the food of the forbidden tree? And hence by denying to show a more careful regard for the peace of the universal church, you manifestly recognize what is the design of the heretics' mighty intrigues, that a more careful discussion should take place between the disciplines of Eutyches and Dioscorus and the emissary of the apostolic see, as if nothing had already been defined. They're saying, I want to discuss it again, Eutyches, the heretic, and Dioscorus. Let's bring it up again to debate. And he says, as if nothing had already been defined. And that what with the glad approval of the Catholic priests of the whole world was determined that the Holy Synod of Chalcedon should be rendered invalid, to the detriment also of the most sacred Council of Nicaea. For what in our own days at Chalcedon was determined concerning our Lord Jesus Christ the incarnation was also defined at Nicaea by the mystic number of fathers, lest the confession of the Catholics should believe that God's only begotten Son was in aught unequal to the Father, or that when he was made the Son of Man, he had not the true nature of the flesh and the soul. The wicked designs of the heretics must be steadfastly resisted. Therefore, we must abhor and persistently avoid what heretical deceit is striving to obtain. Nor must what has been well and fully defined be brought up again for discussion, lest we ourselves should seem at the will of the condemned men to have doubts concerning the things which it is clear agree throughout with the authority of the prophets, evangelists, and apostles. Then you put yourself in the wrong. It's like you're trying to prove yourself all over again. And hence, if there are any who disagree with these heaven-inspired decisions, let them be left to their own opinions and depart from the unity of the church with that perverse sect which they have chosen. For it can no wise be that men who dare to speak against divine mysteries are associated in any communion with us. Let them pride themselves on the emptiness of their talk and boast of the cleverness of their arguments against the faith. We are pleased to obey the apostles' precepts, where he says, "See that no one deceive you with philosophy and vain seductions of men. For according to the same apostle, if I build up these things which I destroy, I prove myself a transgressor, and subject myself to those conditions of punishment which not only the authority of Prince Marcion of blessed memory, but I myself also by my consent have accepted. Because as you have justly and truthfully maintained perfection in midst of no increase nor fullness of addition, and hence since I know you, venerable prince, imbued as you are with the purest light of the truth, waver in no part of the faith, but with just and perfect judgment distinguish right from wrong and separate what is to be embraced from what is to be rejected." Basically, again, he's saying we are not going to debate with Catholics who deny dogmas and bring it back up for discussion again. You simply say, show him the dogma in the council that he denied, condemn him as a heretic, and kick his ass out of the church. Now, that would ruin every scholastic. All their books are full. Even when they believe dogmas, they like to question them and bring them up for you to throw doubts. And they end up even themselves doubting and denying dogmas themselves. Now we read a quote from Pope St. Simplicius, his encyclical Quantum Presbyteriorum to Acacius, Bishop of Constantinople in 476. Those genuine and clear truths which flow from the very pure fountains of Scriptures cannot be disturbed by any arguments of misty subtlety. For the same norm of apostolic doctrine endures in the successors of him upon whom the Lord imposed the care of the whole sheepfold, whom he promised he would not fail even to the end of the world, against whom he promised that the gates of hell would never prevail, by whose judgment he testified that what was bound on earth could not be loosed in heaven. Let whoever, as the apostle proclaimed, attempts to disseminate something other than what we have received, let him be anathema. Let no approach to your ears be thrown open to the pernicious plans of undermining. Let no pledge of revising anything of the old definitions be granted, which is all the scholastics did. They said, we're going to redefine all the old definitions and we're going to explain them even better than they did, which means you undid them. Because as it must be repeated very often, what has deserved to be cut away with the sharp edge of the evangelical pruning hook by apostolic hands with the approval of the universal church cannot acquire the strength for a rebirth, nor is it able to return to the fruitful shoot of the master's vine, because it is evident that it has been destined to the eternal fire. Thus finally the machinations of all heresies laid down by decrees of the church are never allowed to renew the struggles of their crushed attack. They're done. Scholastics don't like that. They want to continue to debate them and bring them up, to doubt them and deny them and to redefine them. I'm now going to quote from St. John Chrysostom, his homily on the Romans, homily 1, on Romans 1:5. By whom we have received grace and apostleship for obedience to the faith. So it was not the apostles that achieved it, but grace that paved the way before them. For it was their part to go about and preach the dogmas, and to persuade was of God, who wrought in them. As also Luke saith, that, quote, he openeth their heart, Acts 16:4, and again to whom it was given to hear the word of God, quote, to obedience, he says, not to questioning and parade of argument, but to obedience. For we were not sent, he means, to argue, but to give those things which we had trusted to our hands. For when the master makes some declaration, those who hear are not to bluster about and be meddlesome about what is told them. They have only to accept it. It was for this reason that the apostles were sent, to tell what they had heard, not to add to it anything of their own, and we for our part should believe. Period. I believe in it. You don't believe in it, you're a heretic. I don't want to hear your excuse. I don't want to hear why you think it's your opinion, your heretical opinion, or why you doubt it. You doubted it, get out of here. It's already been debated. It's been, by the church fathers who brought it up already. We're not going to bring it up again with you. We read about this too. I talk about, therefore, once a man becomes a Catholic and thus adheres to the Catholic Church, he is obliged to believe all the dogmas of the Catholic Church, regardless if he understands them or not. Catholics make this vow in the act of faith. Here's the act of faith that us Catholics take. Oh my God, I firmly believe all the sacred truths, these are the dogmas, which thy holy Catholic Church believes and teaches, because thou, O God, hast revealed them who canst neither deceive nor be deceived. That's our act of faith. Even dogmas we can understand by reason. That's not the first reason that we believe them first by faith. Now, while Catholics are permitted to explain dogmas in order to edify Catholics, enlighten non-Catholics, and to debate or more properly refute non-Catholics in order to try to convert them, they are not permitted to debate so-called Catholics who doubt or deny dogmas. In this case, the Catholic condemns the so-called Catholic's heresy, shows him the dogma, and if he does not accept the dogma, the Catholic must denounce the nominal Catholic as a formal heretic. The fact that he was shown the dogma and doubts or denies it proves that he's a formal heretic. If a Catholic allows another so-called Catholic to bring in debate and doubts, that doubts or denies a dogma, he gives credence to the so-called Catholic in his denial or doubt of the dogma and undermines the popes and church fathers who have already sufficiently debated, explained, and infallibly defined the dogmas. And we'll read this also. Pope St. Scholastics I teaches the same thing. Licit inter varias, which is the errors once condemned, not to be discussed again. And it's his letter to Honorius, Bishop of Dalmatia, in 493, and he teaches this very perfectly here. For it has been reported to us that in the regions of the Dalmatians, certain men have disseminated the recurring terrors of the Pelagian pest, and that their blasphemy prevails there to such a degree that they are deceiving all the simple by the insinuation of their deadly madness. But since the Lord is superior, the pure truth of the Catholic faith drawn from the concordant opinions of all the fathers remains present. What, pray, permits us to abrogate what has been condemned by the venerable fathers, unanimous consensus of the church fathers, which is ordinary magisterium dogmas, and also solemn definitions of popes, and to reconsider the impious dogmas that have been demolished by them? What is it, therefore, that we take such great precautions lest any dangerous heresy, once driven out, strive anew to come up for examination? If we argue that what has been known, discussed, and refuted of old by our elders ought to be restored. In other words, if you do that, you're giving them credence. You don't need to do that. You're undermining the faith. Are we not ourselves offering, which God forbid, to all the enemies of the truth, an example of rising against ourselves, which the church will never permit? Where is it that it is written, do not go beyond the limits of your fathers? Proverbs 22:28. And ask your fathers, and they will tell you, and your elders will declare unto you. Deuteronomy 32:7. Why accordingly do we aim beyond the definitions of our elders? Or why do they not suffice for us? And that's what the Scholastics hate. They hate it. The same old dogmas, the same old thing. So what do? They pervert the dogmas and confound them. That's like modern art. The same old beautiful picture of that mountain, I want to twist it and make it look unintelligible. That's what modern art does. It twists beautiful art. They twist the dogmas into something that's unintelligible and gross. They always want to change things. He says, why accordingly do we aim beyond the definitions of our elders? Or why do they not suffice for us? If in our ignorance we desire to learn something, how every single thing to be avoided has been prescribed by the Orthodox fathers and elders, or everything to be adopted in the Catholic Church has been decreed, why are they not approved by these? Or are we wiser than they? Or shall we be able to stand constant with firm stability if we should undermine those dogmas which have been established by them? And a quote, beautiful statement. And that's what these scholastics do. They say, well, now we have Aristotle and Plato and their philosophy that can help us to explain these dogmas more clearly, and then what they end up doing is unexplaining them. That's what they do. And then they're debating back and forth of things that if you pull out the church fathers that have refuted these things, if you just take out and read it, they did it already. You don't call us back before council again. They said the council already condemned this. I don't got to call another council to re-condemn it again. Councils sometimes do reconfirm things, just to remind people. But we're speaking here specifically of so-called Catholics who are denying or doubting dogmas. This is what the Scholastics did consistently. I said, indeed, the Hellenizing anti-church fathers and Scholastics think they are wiser than the true church fathers and popes who have already sufficiently debated, explained, and infallibly defined dogmas. They think they are wiser by casting doubt or denial on dogmas or allowing others to cast doubt or denial on dogmas without condemning their opinions as heretical nor denouncing them as heretics. Indeed, the anti-church fathers and Scholastics allow debates and arguments among themselves in which dogmas are doubted or denied. And they do not condemn the doubt or denial of the dogmas as heresy, or they do not denounce those who doubt or deny the dogmas as heretics. Instead, they treat those who doubt or deny dogmas as Catholics in good standings. That's another thing we were saying too before about they don't condemn heresy as heresy. They present it as allowable opinion. Matter of fact, today you don't even hear the H words anymore. It's so bad now. This is part of the non-judgmentalism and non-punishmentalism. They don't even use the H word, heresy, anymore. Nothing's a heresy. And if some people may say something's a heresy, but they don't condemn the person who holds it as a heretic. So the two H words, heresy and heretic, are almost completely obliterated from the whole dictionary of these nominal Catholics today. That's the end result of all the scholasticism. Now we're going to get to the next method, which I call 2B. And it is the Scholastics present dogmas. This and the anti-church, the Hellenistic anti-church fathers do this also. It's not just they're Scholastics also, by the way. The Hellenistic anti-church fathers like Jerome and Origen, Clement of Alexandria, Basil, they're Scholastics too, but they didn't call them Scholastics back then. That name wasn't really used till the 11th century. But they were still the same thing. And this 2B method is by presenting dogmas and heresies as allowable opinions. The minute a Catholic allows a heresy to be presented as an allowable opinion, he doesn't condemn it as a heresy. Even though, let's say, he doesn't hold a heresy, he committed a sin of omission. So he's guilty of that heresy. So when someone is teaching to you something that's heretical, you have to say, I got to tell you something, that's a heresy, and you're a heretic. Unless you repent of it. And if he doesn't do that, that Catholic is also a heretic by sins of omission. You're never allowed to present a heresy as an allowable opinion, and you're never allowed to present a dogma as an allowable opinion. You're also a heretic then. If Jesus Christ is God, well, I think that's an allowable opinion. You could believe in that, or you don't have to believe that. If you say that, you're a heretic. Okay? Now, we're going to read about how they were doing this. They were presenting heresies, this is the Scholastics, as allowable opinions, and dogmas as allowable opinions, and they weren't telling you that they were heresies or dogmas. We read about this in the Heretics and Scholars in the Middle Ages, 1000s to 1200 by Hendrik Friedenau. The apostate, I put that in here, Peter Lombard, born around 1095, was surely more of a compiler than a quarreler by nature. His book of sentences, apostate book, scholastic book, is a treasure trove of diverse opinions and pertinent quotations. In the 13th century, the work became a popular handbook, though not, as it has been dubbed, a textbook of religious dogma. Based on the material it contains, the reader is able to form his own opinion on points of controversy. Walter of St. Victor gives this description of how the material is presented. Peter would advance, this is his quote, Peter would advance three theses, a heretical, a Catholic, and a third theorem that was neither one nor the other. As a universal teacher, Magisterium Universalis, Peter would attempt to substantiate all three viewpoints with citations from patristic authorities. He claimed not to know which view was doctrinally correct, leaving it up to the reader to delve further into the literature, an entirely new doctrine by which no one stays Catholic. At any rate, a heresy that supports all heresies equally. And he was living at the time when this was going on. Perfect description of what these people do. Anybody who reads their works would know it. It's in the Summa, it's in the sentences. Now, in many cases, the anti-church fathers and the Scholastics, the reason they didn't call it a heresy was because they held the heresy themselves. So they didn't call it a heresy. We're going to read about this, for example, with the apostate Peter Lombard was one such heretic. He held several heresies. We read from this, again, from the Heretics and Scholars in the Middle Ages, 1000 to 1200 by Hendrik Friedenau. The first wave of speculative thinking had not yet entirely ebbed. However, the material found in the collection of sentences of the apostate Lombard, I put apostate in here, he didn't say, inspired new lines of thought. One such line of thought presented as pure opinion by Peter Lombard has been termed Christological nihilism. Operating with the framework of nature and person, some theologians came to the conclusion that Christ has separately assumed the body and the soul of a human, and hence did not become human in the full sense of the word. When he said something about Christ is nothing in his human nature, you can't even, he said something like that. I have the teachers later on. But he held other heresies too. That was just one of them. That was one of them. But here he is, in this case when he's presenting that, that's why he's not doing it, because he himself holds the heresy. Now, the early scholastics presented some dogmas as dogmas and some heresies as heresies, but also presented some dogmas and heresies as allowable opinions. So sometimes they would. Aquinas would sometimes say something's a dogma or heresy, but not always. They're not always. They would leave a lot of them open for discussion. As time went on, more and more scholastics began to present more and more dogmas and heresies as allowable opinions. What follows is a few examples of many of the heresies that were presented as allowable opinions as time went on. The heresy that the Pope is not the supreme ruler on earth of the Catholic Church, which was condemned by the ordinary magisterium on Pentecost Day in 33, by the solemn magisterium by at least 431, by Pope St. Celestine I at the Council of Ephesus. This heresy was taught by the scholastic canonists and scholastic theologians and apostate anti-popes such as Martin V and Eugene IV from at least the 14th century onward. And even theologians who opposed it, such as later on Innocent IV, and another apostate anti-pope, he opposed that. He said the Pope is the supreme head. They did not condemn it as heresy, but presented it as an allowable opinion, as a non-heretical error, and allowed these canonists and theologians to continue to put forward this opinion that the Pope's not the supreme head of the church. This was big. And so even the ones that opposed it, they didn't oppose it as if it was heretical, only they said, I don't believe in your opinion. And so they were guilty too. And they were all bounced out. That's a basic dogma, Peter being the head of the church. That's why the schismatics fell out in 1050 and why the Anglicans fell out in 1534. These guys who were nominal Catholics, who you still think are Catholics today, wait till you see this debate. They had all different opinions about the Pope, and all of them to undermine his authority. That was going on in a big way from the 14th century forward. The next one was the heresy that infants who died with original sin are happy united to God, which is condemned by the ordinary magisterium on Pentecost Day in 33 AD, and by the solemn magisterium in 418 by Pope St. Zosimus at the 16th Council of Carthage. And this was taught by the scholastics and other modern theologians, such as the apostate Aquinas, from at least the 13th century onward. And even theologians who opposed it did not condemn it as heresy, but presented it as an allowable opinion, a non-heretical error. So even when Aquinas taught this, and other people didn't agree with it, they would oppose it as if it was not a heresy, just like it's an error, a non-heretical error. That's how they would oppose him. The minute you're presented with something like that, Aquinas, you're a heretic, that's heresy, either you repent or get out of here. I don't want nothing to do with you. None of them did that, you see. Because that's another thing we get into. They don't condemn one another so they can continue on with their opinions and their new things. If they started condemning one another, that would end all the questions. That would end all the new things. That would end all the debates. Because you'll be casting these guys out. It was like a league they had amongst of gangsters, where they were protecting one another from being denounced. Another was the Salvation heresy, which was condemned by the ordinary magisterium on Pentecost Day in 33 AD, by the solemn magisterium by at least the 4th century, by the profession of faith definition titled the Athanasian Creed, was taught by scholastics and other modern theologians from at least the 16th century onward. And even theologians who opposed it did not condemn it as heresy, but present it as an allowed opinion, a non-heretical error. For example, the apostate Alphonse de Liguori believed the salvation dogma, but he didn't believe it as a dogma. He didn't say it was a dogma. He believed it as an allowable opinion. He put forward the apostate John Lugo's heresy that apostate Jews can be inside the Catholic Church and in the way of salvation as an allowable opinion. That's the apostate Alphonsus de Liguori, all these scholastics. Another was the heresy that the Pope alone cannot teach infallibly. He needs to have a council of bishops with him, or a council of underlings to confirm it with him. He cannot teach alone infallibly, which was condemned by the ordinary magisterium on Pentecost Day in 33 AD, by the solemn magisterium in 517 by Pope St. Hermisdas in his profession of faith definition titled Libellus Professionis Fidei. And this was taught by scholastics and other modern theologians as part of the conciliarist heresy from the 14th century onward. Also, that's part of denying the Pope's supreme power. In this case, the supreme power of making infallible definitions. And the people that opposed it did not condemn it as a heresy, but they said it's a non-heretical, allowable opinion. The next was the heresy which justified sinful usury, which was condemned by the ordinary magisterium on Pentecost Day in 33 AD, by the solemn magisterium in the 1st century by Pope St. Peter and the apostolic canons, was taught by many scholastics from at least the 12th century onward. And even theologians who opposed it did not condemn it as heresy, but presented it as an allowable opinion and non-heretical error. Another was, these are just a few I'm giving you. I got a book full of these things. The heresy that occult and former heretics are members of the Catholic Church, which was condemned by the Order of Magisterium on Pentecost Day in 33 AD, by the Solemn Magisterium in 579 by Pope Pelagius II, when he confirmed the Second Council of Constantinople of 553. And this was taught by scholastics and other modern theologians from at least the 15th century onward, and even theologians who opposed it did not condemn it as heresy, but present it as an allowable opinion as a non-heretical error. I go over that in my article, Cagin and Bellarmine's Heresies on Former Heretics and the Loss of Papal Office. And it goes on and on and on. This is one of the, as time goes on, pretty soon there's no more dogmas anymore, there's no more heresies. Everybody's free to believe in whatever they want. And one stage would be, some people might say, well, it is a dogma, but the people that deny it are not heretics. That's another stage. It's not enough just to say that Aquinas taught a heresy. You have to denounce him as a heretic. If he taught a heresy, therefore he's a heretic. All right, the next method, which I call 2C, is that the Hellenizing anti-church followers and scholastics defend heresies and dogmas equally before saying which is a heresy or a dogma. Now, in this case, they will eventually tell you that it is a heresy and it is a dogma. But you got to read 60 pages of the garbage where they're defending both equally, and they got you hanging on to maybe the heresy because it sounds good, or maybe the dogma and you don't know, and so you're all confused until maybe 60 pages later, he then tells you, hey, guess what? This is a heresy and this is a dogma. That's one of their techniques they use a lot. And you'll be reading their books and saying, well, what does this guy believe in? Well, what is true and what is not true? What he's trying to do, he's seducing you. He really wants you to hear the heretical opinion. For example, a scholastic might set out a question like this at the beginning of his work. He say, we're going to examine now to see if Jesus Christ is God or if he's not God. He already sinned, okay? He's already guilty. He's a heretic. No Catholic can ever title anything like that. He's allowing the reader to entertain the notion that Jesus Christ may not be God. They do this all the time when it comes to dogmas and everything, right? Then he'll start out by giving you his theological explanation of why Jesus Christ is not God. Real convincingly, with all out-of-context statements, not showing you. He gives you that first, so you're reading it, and you're going, oh, he's already shaking your faith. He's already shaking your faith. Then he says, now we're going to present the teachings where Jesus Christ is God. Then he gives you the ones where it says Jesus is God. And you still don't know what he believes in. So now he's giving you both. Then finally he ends up by saying, now I will tell you what the truth is. It's a dogma that Jesus is God, therefore it's a heresy to teach that he's not God. But what did he already do to you before he told you that? He had you entertaining the notion that Jesus may not be God. He's giving you good proofs on it because he's taking them out of context and twisting them, and he's seducing you. He's seducing you into, he really wants you to fall into the heresy. It's a sneaky way. And they can say, well, he's not a heretic. Look on page 60. He said Jesus Christ is God. It's a dogma. Yeah, but it took him 60 pages to say it. He's teaching Jesus isn't God very convincingly and out of context, so it's a very dangerous thing when people read things like that. And you're reading all these pages and you're swaying people. That's the way you seduce people out of the faith. Now, this is a method very common to them. Now, a lot of times people may not even read through all their works and just give up on it because they don't know what he's teaching on it, or you could get sick of it or whatever, and then you never know what he believes in. But in this case, he's already guilty. No Catholic can ever. The Catholic has to say, we are now going to prove to you that Jesus is God. That's how a Catholic would say that. And we're going to show you and expose a heresy that people say that Jesus isn't God. That's the way a Catholic approaches it. So, but they do this a lot. And so you're not really sure what he even believes until later on. Now this section is titled 2D, and it's the philosophical method of willful ambiguity and willful contradictions, which their works are full of willful ambiguity and willful contradictions. We're going to give you the reasons why. First of all, we quote Psalm 17:44 when I'm reading these people like Aquinas of Summa, just to give you an example. I think that guy's quoted the most to defend a dogma and to deny it at the same time. So people that deny a dogma will say, hey, look what Thomas said over here. People that defend the dogma says, but look what he said over here. And but look what he said over here. So he says one thing here, says another thing here, and that's willful contradictions. Willful ambiguity is when you're not quite sure what he's saying. He could say something, it could be taken in two ways. It could be taken in the orthodox or heretical sense. We're going to tell you the reasons why they do that. But they're loaded with these things. I think he's the most, because he's got so much writings. For example, the apostate Thomas Aquinas has many willful contradictions in his works. I'm just going to go over one of them right here to prove it to you, and where he contradicts himself regarding what he calls the limbo of children. At one place, he says it's not in hell, and then in another place, by logically reading what he teaches, he places him in hell, and then another place, he doesn't place him in hell. So we're going to read about that, his limbo of children, and this is the children that die with original sin. All right? Now, we're reading from his Summa, and it's a supplement, question 69, answer 7. I answer that the abodes of the souls are distinguished according to the soul's various states, so that after death it is either in a state of receiving its final reward or a state of being hindered from receiving it. If it is in a state of receiving its final retribution, that happens in two ways, either in the respect of a good, and then it is paradise, or in respect to evil, and thus as regards actual sin, it is hell, and as regards original sin, it is limbo of the children. There he is. He's saying the only people that go to the hell of the damned is if you have actual sins. If you have original sin only, you go to a place called the limbo of children. He's got a third eternal place he's teaching right here, and that's heresy alone. That was condemned way back in 418. Even it's a basic dogma, by the way, but it was solemnly condemned in 418. It was condemned by the true church fathers that there is no third eternal place. That's either heaven or hell, and the paradise to come is like the heaven, but there's no middle place where souls go. So you can clear, I'll read it again, he says, in respect of the evil, thus as regards actual sin, it is hell, and as regards original sin, it is a limbo of the children. That's heresy. Now, later on when we start reading down there, we say he comes and he actually places the limbo of children in hell now in another place. He doesn't say it explicitly, but it's according, I'm going to read the teachings and you'll see. He says, but in another place he teaches these infants are on the highest level of hell, one level lower than was Abraham's bosom, aka the limbo of the fathers. But you need to combine two of his teachings to know this. In one place he correctly teaches that Abraham's bosom was in the highest level of hell, which he calls the limbo of hell. I quote from the Apostate Thomas Aquinas' Summa, supplement, question 69, article 4. I answer that, consequently, the state of the saints before Christ's coming may be considered both as regards the rest it afforded, and thus it is called Abraham's bosom, and as regards its lack of rest, and thus it is called the limbo of hell. So he says Abraham's bosom, he calls the limbo of hell. Lack of rest, that's stupid what he's saying there. They were either you're resting or you're not resting. How could they be in two states? How could Abraham be resting and not? I never caught that till now. I was reading this. I didn't comment on that in my book, but that's goofy right there. How could they be resting and at the same time not resting? Well, they're not totally saved yet. They're not in heaven, but they are at rest. But my main point on there, he says Abraham's bosom is called the limbo of hell. Now remember that. In another place he teaches that his limbo of children is one level lower than Abraham's bosom. So thus, it has to be in hell, right? This is in his Summa, supplement, question 69, article 6. I answer that. The limbo of the fathers is placed higher than the limbo of children. So now he says that this limbo of children is lower than Abraham's bosom, which is in a limbo of hell. But before he said that as regards actual sin it is hell, as regards original sin it is a limbo of children. He doesn't place them in hell. There he has them in a totally separate area. There's your willful contradictions. You're catching him, and what they teach you is when a guy does that kind of sneaky stuff, you condemn him for the heresy hell. He did teach that the limbo of children is separate from hell. Although here now he's placing, he says it's below the limbo of the fathers. He doesn't say it's in hell, but then when you read about where he places the limbo of the fathers, he says it's in the limbo of hell. This is the typical stuff. He's loaded with thousands of examples like this. Hence, according to these two teachings, Aquinas' limbo of children is in hell. Yet in another place, now we're going to go back to another one of his teachings, where he's actually, because of his teaching, is really describing that they're in a condition where they can't be in hell. And this is where he teaches his heresy that all infants that die guilty only of original sin, or anybody just with so guilty of original sin, is happy and united to God and not united to Satan. Well, if that's true, then that can't be hell. Because the hell of the damned everyone down there is a cohere with Satan, and they're suffering punishments. So now let's read that. Now he's describing a place where they are that is not hell. and which is a heresy in and of itself. This is in his Summa, and it's in his supplement. Book 1, I think, question 1, article 2. And it's reply to objection 5. Although unbaptized children are separated from God as regards to the union of glory, they are not utterly separated from him. In fact, they are united to him by their share of natural goods, and so will also be able to rejoice in him by their natural knowledge and love. And he says they're happy and they're rejoicing and they're united to God. There it is. So this limbo of children, if they're united to God and they're happy, it can't be the hell of a damned. Goes back to what he said originally, which says the limbo of children is not in hell. But before he says it's below Abraham's bosom, that is in hell. There's your willful contradictions. And people can debate this from all sides. This teaching here, though, is so clear what he taught right here. This is a heresy in and of itself. Anybody who dies with the sole guilt of original sin is a co-heir of Satan and suffers for all eternity in hell. That's it. That's a dogma. They're punished in all eternity, and they're not co-heirs with Christ, and they're not happy, and they're not united to Christ. That's a dogma. He denied that dogma. He's also denying another dogma, that he's saying this limbo of children, by his implication in an explicit statement before, that it's not in hell. That's another heresy. There's no third eternal place. Because what other people were doing, especially after they were reading Thomas, said, Thomas puts these guys in hell, but you're going to be denying all kinds of dogmas about hell. If they're happily united to God and are in the hell of the damned, then Jesus Christ is in the hell of the damned, right? His grace is in the hell of the damned. His love is in the hell of the damned. And people are happy in the hell of the damned. And that's contrary to all the dogmas we know about the hell of the damned. So he's denying a whole bunch of dogmas on hell. Other theologians came around and said, that's wrong. We can't put them in hell. So let's put them in this eternal middle place between heaven and hell for all eternity. And so they did that. Some of them put them on the face of this earth, but they can never see God, but they're happy and united. So they came up with other kinds of heresies. He's got at least 2 or 3 heresies in here explicitly, and other heresies about the hell of the damned. But this is an example you're reading about willful contradictions. The guy's a sneaky snake. He knows what he's doing. He's doing it on purpose because he wants to get these damned infants happy and united to God. Where did he get this weakness about infants? He got it from the philosophers. All the philosophers wanted all God's creatures to be saved. They could not comprehend a God who sends his own creatures down to hell for all eternity. The philosophers couldn't comprehend it. Didn't reasonably understand it. So they denied it. That's where he's getting this weakness from. And that's what he's trying to defend. And that's why in one place he says one thing, another place he says another thing, and he nails himself totally on this when he says they're happy and united to God. So he condemned on several heresies on this point alone. You can read my book, Damned Infants, on this. I go into it in detail. He also contradicts himself regarding the eternal world heresy and many other. He contradicts himself all over the place. This is not just unique to the apostate Aquinas. It's unique to all the scholastics. Willful ambiguity, willful contradictions. Psalm 17:44 says, "Thou wilt deliver him from the contradictions of the people." They use these techniques for at least 4 reasons. The first reason is that they try to reconcile contrary opinions instead of rejecting one and accepting the other. And thus many end up with willful contradictions and willful ambiguities. For instance, especially, they want to make Aristotle seem like a Christian and Plato seem like a Christian, to seem like they were believers. And so they try to clean up their heresies and make them orthodox. And in doing so, they try to merge them with Catholic dogmas, and it doesn't work because they're heretical, and that's the way. And they try to tell you they're not really saying what they say, or you're taking them out of context, and they twist it, and they're ambiguous about it, and sometimes they use all kinds of underhanded techniques, but one of them is willful ambiguity, willful contradictions. They're trying to reconcile these philosophers' heretical and idolatrous teachings and merge them in with dogmas. And that's where you're getting willful ambiguity, willful contradictions. I'll give you an example like this. They're trying to reconcile black and white, right? And they end up with gray. You know? That's the what you talk where you would have ambiguity, or something. Then you have contradictions where one might say it is black, one might say it is white, but he didn't say it's black, but he said it was white, and they contradict themselves. Well, we're going to read from this from Giuliano Silano's translation of the apostate Peter Lombard's sentences. He says, "It has been long posited that one of the problems to which the masters of the 12th century turned was the resolution of antimies, or contradictions, in the texts which they inherited. Their attempts to do so are often ridiculed as lacking any in historical sense, and so creating unnecessary difficulties for this aspect of their enterprise. And they did it also with contradiction tests of some of the church fathers they were taken out of context. The expansion of the fund of supposed contradictions is one of the most earnest, he says earnest, I say diabolical, exercises of the 12th century masters, designed to multiply the opportunities, I say confusion and uncertainty, for teaching. More questions, too, also produces more questions. It is true that many of these contradictions would have faded away if the masters had applied a sounder historical judgment to the text which they were reading. They were taking the text out of context and mistranslating them, misinterpreting or mistranslating them. Once again, this assumes that the interest of the masters lay primarily in the resolution of such contradictions, which is not at all an assumption that ought to be made gratuitously. He says they weren't always trying to reconcile the contradictions. A lot of them were fostering contradictions. They didn't want to resolve them. This also helps them produce more questions on top of it. Now, the second reason that they use willful ambiguity and willful contradictions, because it gives them more reasons to debate endlessly and to put more questions over answers, which is what I just said. That's the second reason. We quote from a Wikipedia article on dialectic, and it says Karl Popper has attacked the dialectic repeatedly. In 1937, he wrote and delivered a paper entitled What is Dialectic? And we're talking about the false dialectic used the wrong way, in which he attacked the dialectical method for its willingness to put up with contradictions. Popper concluded the essay with these words: the whole development of dialectics should be a warning against the dangers inherent in the philosophical system building. And in this case, the evil dialectics is purposely done to contradict itself and produce more questions. Another reason for willful ambiguity and willful contradictions is intellectual pride. That causes the scholastics, the Hellenizing anti-church fathers and scholastics, not to admit when they were wrong, when credible proof is shown to them. Hence, in their prideful effort to defend their heresy or other error in the face of credible truth, they use evasive tactics such as willful ambiguity, willful contradictions, and complicated explanations. This happens a lot. We see it with many heretics because they don't want to admit they're wrong. They start making excuses for it. They get into all kinds of trouble. All this confuses the reader, so he's not sure if the scholastic defended his position properly or not, or in many cases the reader is not sure what the scholastic actually believes or teaches. So he uses it for that reason. Because of intellectual pride, he's trying to defend his heresy. And he knows it's heresy when he's presented with the truth. The fourth reason is they use willful ambiguity and willful contradictions is to hide their heresy from the Orthodox or any other person who might detect their heresy. They want to hide it. A lot of them did this. So they're very sneaky so they can remain in communion with the Catholics and get all the goodies that the Catholic Empire and the Catholic Church provided them. So they would hide it. They would do that on purpose. So it says, another reason then they use willful ambiguity and willful contradictions is to hide their heresy from the Orthodox or any other person who might detect their heresy, denounce them as heretics, and cast them out. Hence, when speaking or writing to those who condemn the heresy, they teach the truth, the dogma. But when speaking or writing to those who hold the heresy, they teach the heresy. They'll come out one time and say, Jesus is God. He was never created and never made. Then they'll come over here and say, Jesus Christ was created and he was made, even though he was God, but he was a created God or a made God. And they'll say two different things. It depends on who they're talking to. When they're with their inner group of gangsters and heretics, they'll say that he's not truly God. He was created, he was made. When they're amongst the Orthodox, they will come out and say, well, he was never created, never made, he always existed. They will actually contradict themselves. Then they will also use willful ambiguity, so they would make a statement in which you can interpret it in two ways. That Christ was created and he wasn't created. In one statement, you can interpret it both ways. That's called willful ambiguity. We read about this here. From Heretics and Scholars in the High Middle Ages, 1000 to 1200 by Hendrik Friedenau, Hugh of Hunau, and probably other students of Gilbert as well, did not customarily communicate all he had taught to all of their listeners, but only to a selected consummate students, the heretics that would accept it. An elitist tendency marked those Gilbertines who knew that due to their subtle quality and severely abstract nature, the master's doctrine and subsequent elaborations upon it by many theologians would not be understood. Even Otto of Friesland, who had an affinity for this school, complained that Gilbert said many things that were not consonant with the conventional manner of using language, and they do that to confuse you and to be ambiguous, and then you can interpret it whichever way you want. Hence, when their works are looked at as a whole, they are found in one place, the heresy, and another, the dogma, and hence willful contradictions. One can equally defend the author's orthodoxy or heterodoxy depending on the works he refers to. Also, some passages in their works are willfully ambiguous so that they can be taken in a heretical or orthodox sense. They do this to hide their heresy so that if accused of the heresy, they can present and hold the orthodox view, and contrarily, they can also uphold their heretical meaning when dealing with others who hold the same heresy. We read about this from the Censure and Heresy at the University of Paris, 1200 to 1400, by Thiessen. The mere fact that a defendant would need to make a long explanations about the true meaning of what he had maintained made his views look suspicious. A guy who starts doing it then goes, uh-oh, something's wrong. This guy's going on too long. What's he saying here? The primary concern, real or simulated, of the ecclesiastical authorities was the care of souls. They wanted to protect the pious ears of the learned and the audience against the error and heresy. False teaching did not have a right to be heard. Therefore, some of the subtlety of the academics had to be sacrificed. The bull in which Eckhart was condemned in 329 stated that various of the articles extracted from his writings and sermons were heretical, both as they sounded and in their context. Other articles were merely suspect, but with many explanations and additions, a Catholic sense could be construed. Nevertheless, all the articles were condemned because they could lead the minds of the faithful to a heretical and erroneous interpretation. That's willful ambiguity. Hence, Eckhart had to recount these articles as far as they concerned this sense, the heretical sense. In some, ecclesiastical authorities demanded that theologians not express themselves in an ambiguous way. The defenses, apologies, excusations, and recantations demonstrate that judges and defendants were entangled in a complicated hermeneutical game. So when you have a willfully ambiguous passage, and you know the author did that, you'd condemn him for the heretical meaning in it, and he'd have to reject that heretical meaning. Even though Pius VI was an apostate anti-pope and thus is below teaching invalid, he speaks the truth about how to deal with those whose works contain willful ambiguity and willful contradictions. And this, it says in his Autorum Fidei, 1794. There's heresies in this thing too, but this part's good. So I'm just going to read you the good part, where he really nails this philosophical method of willful ambiguity and willful contradictions. The ancient doctors knew the capacity of innovators and the art of deception. In order not to shock the ears of Catholics, they sought to hide the subtleties of their tortuous maneuvers by the use of seemingly innocuous words, such as would allow them to insinuate error into the souls in the most gentle manner. Once the truth had been compromised, they could, by means of slight changes or additions in phraseology, distort the confession of the faith, which is necessary for our salvation, and lead the faithful by subtle errors to their eternal damnation. Which goes to show you, if you follow these heretics, the blind lead the blind, you both fall into the pit. Matthew 15:14, I think it is. This manner of dissimulation and lying is vicious, regardless of the circumstance under which it is used. For very good reason, it can be never tolerated in a synod, of which the principal glory consists above all in teaching the truth with clarity and excluding all danger of error. Moreover, if all this is sinful, it cannot be excused in the way that one sees it being done, under the erroneous pretext that the seemingly shocking affirmations in one place are further developed along orthodox lines in another place, and even in yet other places corrected, as if allowing for the possibility of either affirming or denying the statement, or of leaving it up to the personal inclinations of the individual. Such has always been the fraudulent and daring method used by innovators to establish error. I say heresy. If it allows for both the possibility of promoting error and of excusing it. It is as if the innovators pretended that they always intended to present the alternative passages, especially to those of simple faith who eventually come to know only some part of the conclusions of some discussions which are published in the common language for everyone's use. Or again, as if the same faithful had the ability of examining such documents to judge such matters for themselves without getting confused and avoiding all risk of error. It is a most reprehensible technique, this is the philosophical method, for the insinuation of doctrinal errors, and one condemned long ago by our predecessor, St. Celestine, who found it used in the writings of Nestorius, we're going to quote that in a minute, or at least one of these guys, several, Bishop of Constantinople, and which he exposed in order to condemn it with the greatest possible severity. Once these texts were examined carefully, the impostor was exposed and confounded, for he expressed himself in a plethora of words, mixing true things with others that were obscure, mixing at times one with the other in such a way that he was also able to confess those things which were denied, while at the same time possessing a basis for denying those very sentences which he confessed. Go both ways. I didn't mean that. No, I meant this, depending on who he's talking to. Now he says, this is willful ambiguity. In order to expose such snares, something which becomes necessary with a certain frequency in every century, no other method is required than this. Whenever it becomes necessary to expose statements which disguise some suspected error or danger under the veil of ambiguity, one must denounce the perverse meaning under which the error opposed to the Catholic truth is camouflaged. Always take the heretical meaning, not the orthodox. Because if you really meant the orthodox, he wouldn't have been ambiguous. He would have been very clear about the orthodox. I don't care. It can have an orthodox meaning. You also gave it a heretical meaning, and that's your pushing. Now, some people could innocently make mistakes, and they should correct them right away. But these heretics did it consistently in all the writings. That's why a lot of them would escape being condemned right away, because some people would think they were orthodox. One guy like that was Eusebius of Caesarea. He denied that Jesus Christ was truly God. He believed Jesus Christ, even though he called him God, he came from God, he believed he was created and he was made. So he didn't believe Jesus Christ was God. But at one time he would tell people, I believe Jesus Christ is God and was never made or created. And another time he would say, I believe Jesus Christ was created and was made. Then he would be ambiguous, so you can take it both ways. And then he would misinterpret it. He'd say, I believe in the Nicene Creed. But he would interpret it in a way which was heretical. They finally caught him later on. But he was a typical of one of these snake-like, sneaky heretics that wanted to stay in communion with the Catholics and get all the goodies. Now here's an example of a guy that's a heretic and pretending to be a Catholic, and he's corrupting a lot of people by this willful ambiguity and his contradictions. Now, Pope Hadrian I in the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 is condemning Eusebius and his techniques of willful ambiguity. For who of the faithful ones in the church, and who of those who are obtained a knowledge of true doctrine, does not know that Eusebius Pamphilii, he's the Bishop of Caesarea, has given himself over to a reprobate cause and holds the same opinions as those who follow the impiety of Arius, that Jesus is not truly God, that he was created and made, that he didn't always exist. In all his historical books, he calls the Son, the Word of God, a creature, a servant, and to be adored as second in rank. But if any speaking in his defense say that he subscribed in the Council of Nicaea in 325, we may admit that this is true. But while with his lips he has respected the truth, in his heart he is far from it, as all his writings and epistles go to show. But if from time to time, on account of circumstances or from different causes, he has become confused or has changed around, sometimes praising those who hold the doctrines of Arius, and other times feigning the truth, he shows himself to be, according to James, the brother of our Lord, a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways, and let him not think that he shall receive anything of the Lord. For if with the heart he had believed unto righteousness, and with the mouth had confessed the truth unto salvation, he would have asked forgiveness for his writings, at the same time correcting them. So then, from these writings of his, he shows that he holds the doctrines of Arius and his followers. They're a good example. And he fooled a lot of people, this guy, till you finally got and read all his writings. He was a sneak, an infiltrator. Now we say all the four reasons, as well as any other reason, that Scholastics and some of the Hellenizing church fathers used willful ambiguity and willful contradictions as proof that they were double-tongued hypocrites, just like the evil Pharisees whom Jesus condemned. Luke 12:1, and when the great multitude stood about him, so that they trod one upon another, he began to say to the disciples, beware ye of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. The Catholic commentary on that says, Christ calls the hypocrisy the Pharisees' leaven, which changes and corrupts the best intentions of men. For nothing is more destructive than hypocrisy, to such as give way to it. And Jesus, son of Sirach, says, in Ecclesiasticus 1:36-40, be not incredulous to the fear of the Lord, and come not to him with a double heart. Be not a hypocrite in the sight of men, and let not thy lips be a stumbling block to thee. Watch over them, lest thou fall and become bring dishonor upon thy soul, and God discover thy secret and cast thee down in the midst of the congregation, because thou camest to the Lord wickedly, and thy heart is full of guile and deceit. This is what Hadrian the First did to Eusebius. He cast them down, exposed them. He also says in Ecclesiasticus 2:14, woe to them that are of a double heart, to wicked lips, and the hands that do evil, and sinner goeth upon the earth two ways. And I got many quotes, more quotes in my book. I end with the most perfect quote on this topic, where St. Paul states this. He says in 2 Corinthians 1:17-18, St. Paul condemning willful contradictions. The things I propose, do I propose according to the flesh, which he's saying he doesn't, that there should be with me? It is, and it is not. But God is faithful, for our preaching, which was to you, was not, it is, and it is not. It is, and it isn't. Jesus is truly God, he's not truly God. Jesus was always existed, Jesus didn't always exist. So he's saying, I did not teach willful contradictions and willful ambiguity. He's condemning all the Hellenizing anti-church fathers and all the scholastics, right there, the great St. Paul. Okay, now the next unique philosophical method is 2E, and they complicate answers. They love to complicate answers. Something you could say in a paragraph, I mean, really clearly, they spread it out over pages, and you don't know what the heck's going on. By the time you're done reading, you forget what the point was. You know, you say, what's the point? Get to the point. I lost what you originally started. And you're trying to catch something, and you're reading, you go, I don't know what this guy's talking about. He's complicating answers. We read about this here in the History of the Christian Church during the Middle Ages by Philip Smith. The exact place occupied by Aristotle in scholasticism is described by Professor Brewer. He adds some excellent remarks on the results produced by the scholastic use of Aristotle, the chief being in the great precision, I say evil precision, of their method, the exaggeration of which leads in its turn to their great fault of attempting to state every question and a set of definite propositions, which often leave the question more involved, complicated, than it was before. The solution being not only unproved, but suggestive of new doubts and questions involving an indefinite series, complicating it. The scholastics complicate answers for at least 3 reasons. They complicate answers to produce more questions. 2, they complicate answers because of their intellectual pride. Complicated answers make them appear to be smart in the eyes of others. 3, they complicate answers either to evade the truth, defend their errors, or hide their errors. By the time one is done reading their long-winded, snake-like complicated answers, one is not sure what the scholastic is teaching and thus accepts his conclusions. Now I give this example. For example, there is a short and simple way to go to the park, as opposed to a long and complicated way. All right, this is my famous, the short way to the park is as opposed to the long way to the park with the instructions. When giving instructions, I'll give you an example of my house, 302 East Joffrey Street. In Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. So I'm going to give you the simple directions to get to the park, which is right next to the Rio Grande River. Okay, when giving directions to the park, a non-pseudo-intellectual person gives the short and simple directions to the park. Okay, make a left, go straight on East Joffrey Street to Ash Street. Turn right on Ash Street and go 1 block to the park. That's how you get there. So when you leave my house, you make a left, go to the first block, make a right, and there's the park. Okay, now let's get the directions from a pseudo-intellectual, a scholastic, a Hellenizing anti-church father. However, a pseudo-intellectual person, such as Scholastics, gives a long, complicated directions to the park. Make a left, go straight on East Joffrey Street to Ash Street. Turn left on Ash Street. Go 3 blocks to 3rd Street. Turn right. Go 4 blocks and make a U-turn. Go 2 blocks and turn left. Go through 2 traffic lights, not 2 blocks, and turn left after the 2nd traffic light. Go until you see the post office and turn left after you pass the post office. Go 2 blocks and make a U-turn. Go 5 blocks and turn right. Go 1 block and turn left. Go 3 blocks and turn right. Then go 6 blocks to the park. Okay, that's a long way. Now, there are several dangers in a long and complicated way. The person following the directions has a better chance of getting lost than by following the short and simple directions. In other words, first of all, again, you say, what's the point? First of all, where am I going even? And if I'm going here, how am I going to get there, you know? Or the person may forget where he's going after following a long, complicated direction. In other words, he may forget what the main point is or goal is, the park. Or, what is even more diabolical and happens very much, is that the directions may not even lead to the park. In which case, Even if you followed all the directions, you will not get to the park, to the truth. You will embrace this heresy, in which you will either think you are at the park, but are not, or you may know you are not at the park and know that you are lost. And that's what they do when you read their writings. And they do, because the one statement, example I gave was this one guy that was in school with the Pontifical Pope John Paul II, and he attended his school and wherever he went to school with him, and he knew him. And he says, when John Paul II got up, he was so smart, nobody understood what he said. And I'm sure he didn't understand what he said neither. That's what he wanted you to do. He wanted to make them feel stupid. So that's one of the reasons, complicated. The other is to lead you into a heresy. That's what the devil does. And that's a perfect example of what we're talking about here by complicating answers. Now the last philosophical method is 2F, and it's by not denouncing heretics as heretics. I said it many times already, they don't condemn heresy as heresy, and they don't denounce the heretics. So if their scholastic brother is a heretic, they don't dare denounce him as a heretic. Just, you're an error. They never call him a heretic, they call him a Catholic in good standing, because that's how they protect one another. That one of their big sins is they want to have the freedom to think whatever they want, to speak whatever they want, and to believe whatever they want. And they don't want nobody to stop them. They don't want no authority over them to stifle their intellectual curiosity when it goes the wrong directions. That's one of their main problems. So if they ended up denouncing one another as heretics, there's no more scholastics. They're all out of the church. The game's over and they can't have their fun anymore. So another philosophical method the scholastics use is to not denounce heretics as heretics. They do this for at least two reasons. One, they do not denounce certain heretics because they hold the same heresy as the heretic, and thus they do not believe he is a heretic, and hence do not denounce him as a heretic. Two, they do not denounce heretical scholastics as heretics because they want to have the freedom to think, believe, and teach whatever they want. Hence, because they do not want to be denounced as heretics themselves, they do not denounce their brother scholastics as heretics, even when they know they are teaching heresy. This is big. St. Augustine teaches about the great danger of this licentious freedom that these people want, that they're looking for. Liberation from God, freedom to do whatever they want, freedom to sin, freedom to believe and teach error. He teaches this in the City of God. That for philosophers speak as they have a mind to, and in the most difficult matters do not scruple to offend religious ears. But we are bound to speak according to a certain rule, lest freedom of speech beget impiety of opinion about the matters themselves of which we speak. He's warning against this. You'll see this today. All your traditionalists, all of them, SSP 10, your City Vicant groups, your Vatican II church, your Renaissance church, as time went on, did anybody call anybody a heretic? You do it, they'll go crazy on you. And if you call them a heretic, then you get into other arguments about material and formal heretic, but they don't even usually call them a heretic. They don't even really condemn anything as heresy anymore. Some of them might say this is a heresy, some may say that, but they will not condemn the guy who holds it as a heretic and denounce him and tell people to avoid him in religious matters. You see this consistently. The scholastics make a pact with one another. I will not denounce you for your heresy as long as you don't denounce me for my heresy. And thus we can go on and on and on and on with our theophilosophy and our scholasticism. We can remain free to think and say and do whatever we want, just like the philosophers of old. As a consequence, they also are guilty of the heresies of non-judgmentalism and non-punishmentalism. The extreme example, you heard Apostate Anti-Pope Francis I say that he cannot judge his anti-cardinal, who's a homosexual. He says, I can't judge him. Can't even judge him. He didn't even condemn what he was doing is mortally sinful, let alone he judge him. I can't judge him. And if you can't even judge him or denounce him, then you're not even going to punish him. We're now going to go over the third way in which they glorify philosophy by using its unique terminologies, which I call scholastic babble, or theophilosophy talk, or TP talk. Scholastic babble is good. I start out with 1 Timothy 1, 6-7. Some going astray have turned aside unto vain babbling, desire to be teachers of the law and understanding neither the things they say, nor wherewith they affirm. I quote from the Contested Theological Authority of Thomas Aquinas by Elizabeth Lowe, and this is after the death of St. Dominic. From the first day a Dominican friar sent foot into his priory, he is trained to reason in scholastic terms, and he studied the most fundamental aspects of his vocation in works written within scholastic literary genres. It is not surprising, therefore, that highly technical and intricately nuanced scholastic terms and the concepts which those terms signified not only comprised the lingua franca of the Dominican magistracy, but worked their way into the daily conversations of the fratres communes, to all the brothers. By the middle of the 13th century, Scholasticism permeated the order of preachers to a far greater extent than any other medieval institution save that of the universities. And we read from the apostate John Gerson in his letter 1400, who condemns this scholastic babble, and so did Gregory the Ninth. Even that was one good thing he did, although he did a lot of other evil things. But Gerson didn't like the scholastic babble neither, and he's condemning it here in 1400. The terms used by the Holy Fathers are changed in opposition to Augustine's saying that it is necessary for us to use language in accord with a fixed rule. Corruption of any type of knowledge can hardly come about more quickly than through this new method. Through these teachings, theologians who use this new method are ridiculed by other faculties, for they then are called dreamers and are said to know nothing about solid truth and morals in the Bible. Through these teachings, numberless paths of errors are opened, for theologians speak and make up for themselves at will terms that other doctors and masters neither understand nor have any interest in understanding. They say the most unbelievable and absurd things, which are said to follow from the senseless fictions. Through these teachings, the church and faith are neither strengthened on the inside nor the outside. Such teachings instead give opportunities for believing that God is not at all simple. That's John Gerson. He was the chancellor of the University of Paris, condemning scholastic babble. Now, I make an addendum. While unique terminologies are good when we're talking about scientific terminologies that are very while unique terminologies are good when dealing with secular sciences such as medicine, chemistry, biology, and math, it is evil and heretical for three reasons when teaching it on faith and morals. And we're going to go over those three reasons and give you some examples of their terminologies. The first reason is that God does not talk that way about faith and morals in the Bible. Just read the way God talks about faith and morals in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and then Jesus Christ, God himself, God and man on earth, the way he spoke and the way the apostles speak. Anyone who reads the Bible and the teachings from the true popes and true church fathers would know that. Here's a sample of scholastic babble from the apostate Bonaventure and the apostate Cajetan, that you may compare it to how God and his faithful chosen people speak. Now, I read this to you. Ask yourself, we've all read the scriptures, we've read the early councils, the true ecumenical councils and papal teachings and true church fathers. Do they speak like what you're going to hear right now, what I'm going to say to you? Now, this is from the apostate Bonaventure's the Breviolioquium from the 13th century. And it's from his chapter 4 on the Catholic expression of the faith. To give Catholic expression to this faith, that regarding the Godhead, two modes of predication are possible, as substance and as relation, three modes of supposition, as essence, as person, and as concept, four ways of expressing substance, in terms of essence, of substance as such, of persons, and of hypostasis. Five modes of assertion, in terms of person, hypostasis, concept, substance, and essence, and three modes of differentiation, an order of the origination, an order of the predication, and the order of reason. There it is. That's just a little. You want to read the whole thing? Go ahead. You're going to get sick. Get your vomit bags. Does God talk like that? Who's he talking to, this guy? You don't talk about faith and morals the way this man is talking. This is an abomination. I'm going to give you an example from the apostate Thomas Cajetan on the comparison of the authority of the Pope and Council in 1511. Quote, all of these points are certain, and from them it follows necessarily that if the conditions which are not necessary absolutely, but are so for its being done well, fail in Peter, he is not therefore so deposed that the conjunction could be dissolved, so that Peter could be touched by the power to depose. For those dispositions which are not required in a subject, so that it is united efficaciously to the form, but the subject can be united to the form, as much as these dispositions, as with their contraries and constitute a composite, are not such that their contraries pertain to the dissolution of the compound. I'm not making this up, folks. I know you can make it up, but I'm not. You go read it. Anybody knows what I'm saying. They don't always talk like this, but they talk like that a lot. It's a whole new language. Where did it come from? It's not the way God speaks about faith and morals. Now, not only does God and his faithful chosen people not speak like that when teaching on faith or morals, but they also condemn those who use these unique terminologies and methods of the philosophers when teaching on faith and morals. 1 Timothy 1, 6-7, some going astray have turned aside into vain babbling, desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither the things they say, nor whereof they affirm. 2 Timothy 2, 14-16, of these things put them in mind, charging them before the Lord, contend not in words, for it is to no profit, but to the subverting of the hearers. Carefully study to present thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth, but shun the profane and vain babblings, for they grow much towards ungodliness. Even if this did make sense with these, it's still wrong. We're going to get into that as we go on. Ecclesiasticus 21, verse 15, 19, and 21. But there is a wisdom that aboundeth in evil. The talking of a fool is like a burden in the way. The knowledge of the unwise is as words without sense. What I just read to you. Ecclesiastes 7:17. Be not overjust and be not more wise than is necessary, lest you become stupid. This applies to all of them. Ever learning, never attaining to the knowledge of truth. They're stupid. The more they idolized the reason, they even lost reason. They even lost common sense. The thing they idolized, they lost. We read from Isaiah 33:18-19. The heart shall meditate fear. Where is the learned? Where is he that pondereth the words of the law? Where is the teacher of the little ones? The shameless people thou shalt not see, the people of profound speech, so that thou canst not understand the eloquence of his tongue, in whom there is no wisdom. The wisdom is simple speech, not in profound speech. It means these babblings, these terminologies, these unique methods and terminologies. 1 Corinthians 1:20, where is the wise, where is the scribe, where is the dispute of this world? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? And we have here Peter Damian, and this is his letter 23 to the judge Bonsuomo, and before 1047. He says, I am not unaware, brother, that when one of my letters is delivered to a layman, it is at once carefully searched for the eloquence of speech. The logic of the arrangement of subjects is investigated, whether it gives evidence of rhetorical color, whether the contents involve propositions of dialectical subtlety, or whether finally, categorically, or other hypothetical syllogisms demonstrate the propositions with incontestable arguments. He's saying they search for scholastic methods in my letters. But those who live in the Spirit of God despise these and similar elegant buffooneries as something truly frivolous and vain, and as the apostle says, count them as so much garbage. Philippians 3:8. Paul also asserted that he had not spoken to his disciples in the language of worldly wisdom, so that the fact of the cross on the cross might have its full weight. 1 Corinthians 1:17. How fine indeed, how useful, how honorable is the discourse that while pretentiously inflating its author's ego with long-winded vainglory annuls the value of the cross, which is the salvation of the world. Now he goes on here in paragraph 4. Now, my friend, you should not expect to find in my letters the frequent bite of wanton sarcasm, nor should you look for the graces of studied style. May you rather take pleasure in the simplicity of the lamb that leads one to God than in the cunning of the serpent whose venom deals death. Now, I have a whole bunch of quote on him. It goes on long. I got many more quotes in the book on this. I just gave you a little bit here of how they're condemning the scholastic babble. Now, as I said before, even though apostate anti-Pope Gregory IX was a scholastic, glorified philosophy was an abomination, one thing he correctly condemned was scholastic babble. That he did condemn in his letter, Abigitis, which was directed towards the University of Theologians at the University of Paris, and he was telling them not to use these terminologies. And this was in 1228. They ought to explain theology according to the approved traditions of the saints, and not with carnal weapons. They do not reduce to memory that saying of the apostle which we believe they have already frequently read, avoiding the profane novelties of words and the oppositions of knowledge falsely so called, which some seek and have erred concerning the faith. 1 Timothy 6:20. O foolish and slow of heart, and all things which the protectors of divine grace, namely the prophets, the evangelists, and the apostles have spoken. And while by extorted, nay rather distorted expositions, they turn the sacred words, divinely inspired, to the sense of the doctrine of philosophers who are ignorant of God. Therefore, lest a rash and perverse dogma of this kind, as a canker spreads, he's calling it like a heresy, and infects many, and makes it necessary that Rachel bewail her lost sons, We order and strictly command, by the authority of those present, that entirely forsaking the poison mentioned above, without the leaven of worldly knowledge, that you teach theological purity, not adulterating the word of God by the creations of philosophers. Be content with the terminology established by the fathers. He's condemning scholastic babble, but he did not condemn the philosophical works. He continued to let them study them, so he was guilty too. But this is just one thing he did that was correct. Gerson also was condemning it, what we call the scholastic babble. I say God has cursed them like with a deep sleep, and they're drunk without being drunk. I said it's like I said to these guys, it's like they were doing LSD, or they're drunk without doing LSD or without being drunk. They're just drunk because of their intellectual pride when you hear the way they talk. Our Lord says, "Be astonished and wonder, waver and stagger, be drunk, and not with wine. Stagger and not with drunkenness. For the Lord hath mingled for you the spirit of a deep sleep. He will shut up your eyes. He will cover your prophets and princes and that see visions." Isaiah 29, 9-10. He's covered them up with stupidities. So the things that come out of our mouth, you would say, is this guy drunk? Is he crazy? Is he insane? And our Lord talks about how when he teaches us, he teaches us simply. And Matthew, and to the little ones, Matthew 11:25. At the time Jesus answered and said, "I confess to thee, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because thou hast hid these things from the wise and prudent, and has revealed them to the little ones." Now, the second reason that it's evil, scholastic babble, is because theology is not a secular science like chemistry or biology. The second reason using terminologies unique to philosophy when teaching on faith or morals is evil and heretical is because it tries to put God into a test tube, in a petri dish, and under a microscope in order to dissect and analyze him in the Catholic faith, as one would with a secular science like biology, in which one dissects and analyzes a frog or a human cell. It rips the heart out of God and the faith and makes them cold, lifeless, and sterile. Anybody reads these guys? It is cold, it is death. Read Augustine, read Aquinas of Summa. Read Augustine's City of God, read Aquinas of Summa. There you go. One is living, one is dead. St. Paul teaches that the Catholic faith is living and effectual, not dead and sterile. Hebrews 4:12, "For the word of God is living and effectual, more piercing than any two-edged sword, reaching unto the divisions of the soul and the spirit, of the joints also and the marrows, and it is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart." It's living and effectual. The difference between a living faith that puts faith over reason and the heart over the brain, and a dead faith that places reason over faith and the brain over the heart, can be compared to tasting a steak, as opposed to writing about how a steak tastes. No matter how much one writes about how a steak tastes, he will never be able to convey how it tastes, no matter what. That's the way you can put it. You read St. Augustine's City of God, it's living, it's personal. It reaches into your heart and into your soul. You read the Summa, it's purely brain stuff. I was reading brain stuff. It's not living. The Hellenizer anti-church fathers and scholastics try to analyze and describe God in the Catholic faith in a secular scientific way, and thus assert themselves over God and the Catholic faith. They attempt to get hold of God, lock him up, do experiments on him, and be masters over him. It is not only disrespectful, arrogant, and rebellious, but it is also untenable. You can't do it, no matter how you try. It complicates, confuses, and kills the Catholic faith, true theology. We read from Heretics and Scholars in the High Middle Ages from 1000 to 1200 by Hendrik Friedenau. Philosophy was thus no longer regarded merely as a love of wisdom, but evolved into the science of drawing distinctions, solutions to disputes, or the semblance of solutions, seem quite often to rest on terminological distinctions without assuming real-life quality. In terms of nomenclature alone, the doctrine of the Trinity became in a specialist's hands even more complicated and thus even less intelligible. The same thing occurred with other topics as well. Theology for the first time became a science in a narrower sense of the word, like a secular science. Were it not for a more pronounced belief in the potential of human reason and the attendant self-confidence among researchers, this upturn would not have been possible. In the process, use was made of Botheists for another apostate Botheist. He was an idolater. I don't think he was even. This guy's really bad. They love Botheists, these guys. Use was made of Botheists' fourfold classifications of the faculties of the human soul. The new learning rested on two pillars, so to speak: the Christian and the pagan traditions of revelation and reason. The Holy Scriptures no longer enjoyed a God-given immunity, and they became subject to scrutiny. Auxiliary tracts were soon available. Allen of Lilly authored the Regulali Theologica, the Principles of Theology, a compendium of grammatical, arithmetical, and dialectical axioms transmitted into maxioms applicable to the field of theology. However, the concepts and methods devised for the liberal arts were not applicable to propositions about God. Nevertheless, they harbored the hope that in light of its rational quality, this mode of thinking was not too far off the mark. Mathematical theorems, more than other sorts of concepts, were transferable to God. This sort of thing puts into stark relief the fatal flaw of scholarly activity, the perception that it was an end in itself. They're trying to put God in a test tube and scientifically explain everything. Now, in the 19th century, the apostate Aristus Brownson speaks of the bombastic scholastics of his day and their scholastic babble, which he was against. Apostate Aristus Brownson, 19th century. And this is in his, from the Catholic Dogma by the apostate Father Michael Mueller, and it's in part 2, section 13, where he quotes it. I feel surprised at the fact that so many of the young men educated at certain Catholic colleges, they're not really Catholic, have become infidels. I cannot account for this otherwise than by presuming that the religious training there is not solid enough, that the heathen world is too much read and studied. I would like to know whether God will show himself more merciful to those of our clergy who take so little interest in the religious instruction of our youth, who, when they condescend to instruct them, do so in bombastic language and scholastic terms, which the poor children cannot understand, taking no pains to give their instruction in plain words and in a manner attractive for children. Not just children, even adults. It's not fit for anybody. You read before, the guy said, even your true theologian said, what the heck are these guys talking about? They didn't understand it, and they didn't want to understand it. No, thank you. I don't want to learn it. Now we're going to come up to the third reason why they do it. Maybe you'll guess this again. Why do lawyers have their own language? They have their own language to keep it from the people so they can't practice law, and they got to go and give their money to the lawyers. They keep it amongst an elite few, and so now you got to go to them to get your law done. That's another reason why they do it. They want this scholastic babble, but only amongst an elite few, so your typical layman cannot talk about theology. They now got to go to these guys, and the theologians now become their interpreters of everything, because your average person cannot understand them. See? So the third reason using terminology unique to philosophy when teaching on faith or morals is evil and heretical is because its purpose is to keep the faith theology only known to an elite few. To do this, the scholastics formed a new language that only they could understand. Hence, those that do not know this new language, the scholastic babble, cannot join their elite club. This new language is not born out of necessity, as with some secular sciences such as biology, but is born to undermine the simplicity of the Word of God and the Catholic faith, to exalt man over God, reason over faith, the brain over the heart, and to keep knowledge about faith and morals among an elite few out of no necessity but of arrogance and pride. And God, it's a complete opposite. God wants everyone to know His Word. It's simple. Everyone to know it. The modern lawyers created a new language, not out of necessity, but to keep their knowledge among an elite few in order to make more money. They created the legalese language, so that only they can understand it, and thus men must go to them regarding legal matters that they could have handled themselves if not for this legalese babble. These new evil languages formed by the scholastics and lawyers do not simplify things but complicate them. What could be said in a few words and simply is said in many words and complicatedly. God Himself tells us that His Word, the Catholic faith, true theology, is made for the average person and thus for the simple to understand. Proverbs 27, verse 7 and 21. He will keep the salvation of the righteous and protect them that walk in simplicity. For they that are upright shall dwell on the earth, and the simple shall continue in it. Proverbs 11:3. The simplicity of the just shall guide them, and the deceitfulness of the wicked, the scholastics, shall destroy them. Proverbs 28:6. Better is the poor man walking in simplicity than the rich man, scholastics who are rich in intellect, in crooked ways. That's Proverbs 28:6. The Word of God, the Catholic faith, true theology is simple because it is not a science like any other science, because it is a living, spiritual faith, and hence speaks first to the heart and then to the brain. In fact, God Himself loves simplicity. Regarding faith and morals, God thinks and speaks concisely and simply, and thus not as a philosopher or scholastic. One parallel chapter 29, verse 17. I know, my God, that Thou provest hearts and lovest simplicity, Wherefore I also, in the simplicity of my heart, have joyfully offered all these things. Philosophy and scholasticism is not the easy, simple, and true way, but the hard, complicated, and impossible way. Wisdom 6:13-15. Wisdom is glorious and never fadeth, all away, and is easily seen by them that love her, and is found by them that seek her. He that awaketh early shall find her, and shall not labor, for he shall find her sitting at the door. The wisdom of the philosophers and scholastics is not only hard to see and requires much labor, but it is also false and impossible to see when all things they teach are considered. It leads one into denying the faith and eternal damnation. Even if scholasticism occasionally makes sense to other scholastics, it is still evil and heretical because it undermines the simplicity of the Word of God, exalts man over God, reason over faith, their brain over the heart, and keeps knowledge of spiritual things among an elite few out of no necessity but of arrogance, pride, and disobedience to God. Now, we're going to end this part by giving you a few more examples of scholastic babble, so get your vomit bags ready. Now, we're going to tell you about the guy, the first guy that brought these terminologies in, the first scholastic. And this guy could be considered a bridge between the anti-church fathers and the scholastics, because some people consider John Damascene a church father, but he's really an anti-church father, and we can also consider him a scholastic. He was in the 8th century, so he was a bridge. He's the first one that actually got together a whole dictionary of these unique terminology of philosophers. It was him. Now, when he wrote this book on it, it didn't make any progress. It just lay where it was. Only a few people studied it, so it didn't take off till later on. But when the 11th century started, then this stuff started to come out, and they started to bring it more and more popular. The scholastic terminologies became really popular in the 12th century and onward. But when he was alive, it never really took root. But he's the father of it. A lot of people even call him the father of scholasticism. I'm going to read from the Nominal Catholic Encyclopedia on John Damascene. John of Damascus was the last of the Greek fathers. Some consider, he wasn't a father, he was an anti-church father. Some consider him the precursor of scholastics, whilst others regard him as the first scholastic, and his De Fide Orthodoxa as the work of scholasticism. The Arabians too owe not a little of their fame, of their philosophy, to his inspiration. His work is inexhaustibly thesaurus of tradition, which becomes a standard for the great scholastics who followed. We're now going to quote from the guy who translated John Damascene's works, this Frederick H. Chase, and it's from 1958, this book, and he's making a commentary on John Damascene. He says, the introduction, in the philosophical chapters of John Damascene, there's a collection of explanations of dialectical terms, but this appears in chapter 65 in accordance with his avowed intention of setting forth the best contributions of the philosophers of the Greeks. The author devotes himself in this philosophical part to a careful treatment of the 5 universals and the 10 categories of the Aristotelian system. Now, I'm just going to read from his philosophical chapters, from his own words, from his own works. And this is Apostate John Damascene, The Font of Knowledge, chapter 5. Since it is our purpose to discuss every simple philosophical term, which are not simple, we must first of all know with what sort of terms it is that philosophy is concerned, so we begin our discussion, our terms. Now he creates a whole dictionary on this scholastic babble. This is from chapter 4. Being is the common name of all things which are, it is divided into substance and accident. Substance is the principle of these two, because it has existence in itself and not in another. Accident, on the other hand, is that which cannot exist in itself, but is found in the substance. For the substance is the subject, just as matter is of the things made out of it, whereas an accident is that which is found in the substance as in a subject. Chapter 29, the word hypostasis has 2 meanings. Thus, when used in the strict sense, it means substance simply. However, the hypostasis, subsisting in itself, means the individual and the distinct person. In hypostanton, or what has real existence, has 2 meanings also. Thus, it may mean being in the strict sense, and thus, in this sense, we not only call substance in the strict sense in hypostatic, but also accident also. And it also means hypostasis in itself. That is to say, the individual. And hypostanton, or which has not real existence, is also used in 2 senses. Thus, that which has absolutely no existence at all is in hypostaton, and the accident is also so called because it does not subsist in itself, but in the substance. And it goes on and on and on and on. Does Almighty God talk like that? Who talks like that? Philosophers. These bastards. How can anybody like this? You've got to be an absolute, your brain, your intellect. I know what kind. This is as perverted as anybody can ever get. You talk about sexual lust or lust after money. This is just as bad. Intellectual lust is just as bad. And they become stupid. I got more in my book on this, so I just quoted a little here. Now we're going to read about a scholastic, apostate Gilbert of Poitiers, who was in the 12th century, about his use of scholastic babble. We're going to read this from the Heretics and Scholars in the Middle Ages, from 1000 to 1200 by Hendrik Friedenau. Gilbert, was an apostate, and his students undertook to coin a new rational and subtle terminology for the field of speculative theology, and it was inevitable that its modes of expression would become a stumbling block for the traditional theologians. According to Otto of Friesling, Gilbert was born in Poitiers, where from 1142 on he was engaged in teaching and subsequently served as bishop. He had previously been a canon in Chartres and studied logic and theology in Paris. In 1146, while bishop, Gilbert came under the suspicion of heresy. Two of his archdeacons filed a complaint with Pope Eugene III, anti-pope, apostate anti-pope, concerning the sermon delivered by their superior. In two consistories held in Paris, 1147, in the aftermath of the Council of Reims in 1148, the matter was addressed by the Pope and the bishops. We have already related how the Pope declared that he scarcely understood Gilbert's scholarly explications. And he says, what the heck are you talking about, is what he actually ended up saying. He says, would you please tell us whether you believe A, B, C, D or not? That's how it ended up. They were all listening. Nobody understood what he's talking about. It says, an elitist tendency marked those of the Gilbertines, who knew that due to their subtle quality and severely abstract nature, the master's doctrines and subsequent elaborations upon it by many theologians would not be understood. They did it on purpose. He, Gilbert, postulated that the language of theology would, through its subordination to the rules of classical grammar and dialectic to the philosophical terminologies, be raised up to a new standard, one revealing new perspectives. In the process, however, a 1,000-year-old verbal tradition fell by the wayside. Gilbert performed this experiment in terms of the very topic that theologians found most difficult and, to be sure, most interesting, the doctrine of the Trinity. In the process, he perforce aroused the resolute opposition of thinkers in conservative circles who deployed against him a profusion of authorities from the centuries past, or simply declared, this explanation is over our heads. The balance between the authority and reason seemed to have been tipped. The language that was rich in imagery and tugged at the heartstrings, that imparted the secrets of God, was supposed to yield to something new, contrived by the scholars, dead and sterile. Your scholastic babble and glorifying philosophy and all its other methods. Even when this new language was not objectionable, it could still trigger misunderstandings. All right, now we're going to end with just some scholastic babble of the apostate Thomas Aquinas, and he's got a lot of it. I just picked out a little bit of it. The book has more. I'm going to read a little bit here, but he's got a lot of it. And this is from his Summa, Book 1, Question 46, Article 1, Reply to Objection 1. Before the world existed, it was possible for the world to be. All right, already there, the guy's a kook, right? If I'm in his class, I might kill the guy. You know, that's what happens if I... Get out of here, you're nuts! If I had your power over you, I'd beat you so silly. Look at it, look, I'll read that again. This is how it starts. Before the world existed, it was possible for the world to be. Not indeed according to passive power, which is matter, but according to the active power of God, and also accordingly as a thing is called absolutely possible, not in relation to any power, but from the sole habitude of the terms, which are not repugnant to each other, and which seems possible is opposed to impossible, as appears from the philosopher, big P, Aristotle, in his Metaphysics. He always puts the big P on there. It's where he's getting it from. And on the same topic, in reply to objection 6, he says, the first agent is a voluntary agent, and although he had the eternal will to produce some effect, yet he did not produce an eternal effect, nor is it necessary for some change to be presupposed, not even on account of imaginary time. For we must take into consideration the differences between a particular agent, that presupposes something and produces something else, and that universal agent who produces the whole. Is this talking to your heart? Or am I missing something here? This guy cool? The particular agent produces the form and presupposes the matter, and hence it is necessary that it introduce the form and due proposition into the suitable matter. Hence it is correct to say that it introduces the form into such matter and not into another on account of the different kinds of matter. Would this guy not get arrested for being drunk or on LSD? Really, if you ran into this guy. But university people, that's why they're doing drugs in these universities, because they love this stuff. Can you imagine you give him like an LSD, he'd really go off to town. But he didn't need drugs to do this, is what I'm saying. This is just diabolical. Look what he says here on the same article here, reply to objection 9. As the effect follows from the cause that acts by nature according to the mode of its form, so likewise it follows from the voluntary agent according to the form preconceived and determined by the agent. All right, now we'll read one more on him here. It says from his Summa. Say it, Ryan. Please, no more. Oh, one of the brothers is throwing up. Excuse me, he had to go to the bathroom.
You do need drugs to think that you can understand them.
If you need drugs, yeah. If you understand, if you try to understand them, I'm not saying that some of these things may not make sense in some weird way, but when you try to understand them is when you're in trouble. I ask you again, does God talk like that? Here's from his Summa, Book 1, Question 115, Article 6. I answer that. Wherefore it seems that in such things at least, everything happens of necessity, according to the reasoning of some of the accidents, who supposing that everything that is has a cause, and that given the cause, the effect follows of necessity, concluding that all things happen of necessity. This opinion is refuted by Aristotle, again his big boss, as to the double supposition. Whether he's right or not, but he analyzes the guy, but here's how he talks about this thing. Everything that is a being per se, who are the most evil beings in the world? Human beings, right? Everything that is a being per se has a cause, but what is accidentally has not a cause, because it is not truly a being, since it is not truly one. Now, it is manifest that a cause which hinders the action of a cause, so ordered to its effect as to produce it in the majority of cases, clashes sometimes with this cause by accident. And the clash, it sounds like they're doing some nuclear stuff here with the nuclear thing. Now that has a reason. They're not theology, with the fission, nuclear, and they got the uranium-238, clashes sometimes with the cause by accident, and the clashing of these two causes, in so much as it is accidental, has no cause. Consequently, what results from the clashing of causes is not to be reduced to the further pre-existing cause from which it follows of necessity.
Some nuclear fission went off in his head.
That guy is anathema. Any true Catholic who puts up with this, likes this, and allows this is an apostate. He's an apostate. He's an idolater. And it's sacrilegious because you're mixing it with the Catholic faith. Now I end this part 4, in which I went over the ways in which they glorify philosophy, with this one statement. Trying to find out what a scholastic is actually teaching among his willful ambiguity, complicated answers, other philosophical methods, or philosophical terminologies is like trying to catch a greased pig. And worse, because one may be able to catch a greased pig. One sure way to catch a greased pig is you shoot him. And that's what should have been done to these scholastics. You shoot them. They weren't holy. They had holes in their head. That's about as holy they were. I would like to put bullets in their head and put them out of their misery. Not just their misery, because they're making everybody else miserable. So they're full of all kinds of nonsense. Hath not the Lord made foolish the wisdom of the world?